Let's see. Hi, everyone. It's, well, I can't see because I turned my computer around. 5/19/2024, 7:20 p.m. My hair in front of the camera. I want to do a little bit something different today. Let's see. Let me bend the camera. Still gotta see the camera. I bought this book a couple months ago because I had watched a TV adaptation of Rod Serling's Patterns, and then I learned that there was a movie adaptation of Patterns. I don't know if it was the movie adaptation of the TV adaptation of Patterns, but I don't think so. I think it was just an adaptation of it. So I really liked the play. I wanted to um I wanted to buy an anthology of his works, but I've yet to see if there's any available. But if I was going to buy anything of his, it was going to be the play Patterns. And he talks about things concerning it, and I would like to talk about that now. So, first of all, I love this cover art. I think it's nice. It's pretty cool. It's a typewriter. Looks like a spotlight a little bit. I like the black and white. Here's the back with all the blurbs. It's hard to do this. Okay, there you go. And then, let's see. For my wife, Carol, publication of these original books is done in tribute to Rod Serling, whose concern for the well-being of humanity still resonates with all who are exposed to his work. So, in the table of contents, there's a nice forward, and then there's nice bits. I don't know if Rod wrote bits for magazines or if this is excerpts from interviews. I'd have to double check. But there's a nice chunk about writing for television, and I was getting my hair done, as you can tell in the other thumbnail, and you can tell my hair is spilling over the camera. I got my hair done the other day, and I took this book with me to the salon, and I was reading it, and I thought, God, I really love this. I would really like to share this on my channel, so that's what I'm doing right now. But I have, like I said, I wanted an anthology, but I only have, looks to be 4 plays, one of which is Patterns, the other is The Wreck, the other is Old MacDonald Had a Curve, and Requiem for a Heavyweight. I know of Patterns, and I know of Requiem for a Heavyweight. I don't know the other 2 very well. But I'm going to, let's see, read on this channel the forward. I don't know if let's see. I don't know if I could read this many pages. I want to, but that I might have to split it up into a 2-parter. But I didn't want to give an official reading because I kind of want to talk about what I'm reading in the little commentary along with what I'm reading. So I think I'm going to do that. I'm going to go ahead and spin the computer around. No, you don't need to see my face. You've seen it. It's in the thumbnail. You guys know what I look like now. And we'll go from there. I might read some wiki info on them too. The web tech guy gave me this neat little cover up on the cam. And that way I can handle doing live stuff. So let's see. Let's see. First, I want to give some background information. Okay, let me bring up his wiki page, because we all know wiki's reliable. It's reliable enough for me. First of all, from a personal anecdote, I think many people from a younger generation, or at least my generation, might have heard of Rod Serling from The Simpsons. They did a nice little adaptation of I don't want to, The Twilight Zone, and his other one that's, I'm drawing a blank. Oh fuck, what was it? What was his other work? Let me see. This is so embarrassing. Night Gallery. They did a whole kind of Rod Serling Halloween themed episode with something on the wing. The fuck, what is his name? This is so, I'm getting old. I can't remember anything anymore. Fuck, this is bugging me. No, I can't. Shatner, Jesus. I couldn't think of it. They did a whole rip on Shatner and with his episode of The Twilight Zone and of Night Gallery. And I was looking up certain interviews with Rod, and I gotta admit, I don't know much about him, as I haven't seen the Twilight Zone episodes in their entirety. I've only ever seen patterns. But Rod he's kind of a goofy looking guy. I think I read some of this wiki on him in another rambling thing. He was born on December 25th, 1924 in Syracuse to a Jewish family. He was the second of two sons born to Esther, filmmaker, and Samuel Lawrence Serling. Serling's father had worked as a secretary and an amateur inventor before his children were born, but took on his father-in-law's profession as a grocer to earn a steady income. Sam Serling, I always want to say Sterling. I don't know why I got stuck on Rod Serling. It's not Rod Serling, it's Rod Serling. Sam Serling later became a butcher after the Great Depression forced the store to close. Rod had an older brother, novelist and aviation writer Robert J. Serling. I did not know that. And he has a pretty extensive wiki. Robert J. Serling. Ooh, has publications with Doubleday, the Laurel Group, Dial Press, and St. Martin's. Interesting. Let's see. I would read a bunch of this, but I think I'm about to in the forward plus his thoughts about television. So I think I'm just going to go ahead and do that. I want to say his death. Serling was said to smoke 3 to 4 packs of cigarettes a day. On May 3rd, 1975, he had a heart attack and was hospitalized. He spent 2 weeks at Tompkins County Community Hospital before being released. A second heart attack 2 weeks later forced doctors to agree that open heart surgery, though considered risky at the time, was required. The 10-hour-long procedure was performed on June 26, but Serling had a third heart attack on the operating table and died 2 days later at Strong Memorial Hospital in Rochester, New York. He was 50 years old. And let's see. His funeral and burial took place on July 2nd at the Lakeview Cemetery, Interlaken, Seneca County, New York. And I was just looking at his site the other day, and it's really quite lovely. It's in between two lakes, I think. I'd have to look again. And it's quiet, and it's not a cloistered cemetery. I think it's open to the public. Maybe if ever I'm up near Interlaken, Seneca County, I'll take a little run out there. But I don't know. I don't know that I'll ever be up that way. But that was a little info on him, and let's dive in here. Ooh, yeah, I might have to separate this into two things, but let's see. Okay, so this is the foreword to Patterns. The book is just titled Patterns because it's easy for an anthology. I don't know. Okay, by Mark Dawidziak. Rod Serling was the most recognized writer on the planet. During the 1960s and 70s, people who couldn't pick Norman Mailer or Saul Bellow out of a police lineup knew Rod Serling. They knew the voice, the face, and the mannerisms. The Twilight Zone did that. It turned a well-known and acclaimed writer into that awful and bewilderingly amorphous American creation, a celebrity. It's a status that few writers attain. Mark Twain pulled it off before Rod Serling. There aren't many in their league. And let's face it, if you recognize the name Rod Serling, and there's every good chance you do, it's undoubtedly because you have spent some quality time in that wondrous land whose boundaries are that of imagination. At some point, you crossed over into the Twilight Zone. And I just got done saying I haven't, and I haven't seen episode 1, but I know of it, and I know I've watched the Shatner scene. Here we go. It is, without question, his towering contribution to American culture and American literature. Yes, make no mistake, literature. I didn't. Serling was the beloved anthology show's creator, iconic host, and principal writer, penning a staggering 92 of the 156 episodes. So, like I said, I'm gonna talk a little bit in between reading about this. The guy lived to 50, and in keeping with my obsession with people whose work I admire ages and what they did with their time when they had it, 50, if you can make it to 50, I think that's a pretty big feat. I thought it was a pretty big feat to make it to 30. But to die at 50 just feels wrong. It feels way too early, and it feels like, especially for somebody like Rod, who didn't hesitate and did have the nerve to dive into his passions, it felt like it was cut short. And it's a little hard to accept that truth, but let's continue. It is without question, but keep in mind that Serling, yet a megawatt celebrity, was a well-known and acclaimed writer before he opened the Twilight Zone for business on October 2nd, 1959. Keep it in mind because that's what the book in your hand is all about. It's in my hands, not hand. I'm holding it primarily with one hand. Many are fond of quoting F. Scott Fitzgerald's line about there being no second acts in American lives. They're probably misusing the line since there's evidence that Fitzgerald didn't believe it, and he died even younger than Serling at, 44? Anyone with doubts about the line can happily point to Serling's career, which more than refutes this oft-cited sentiment. It obliterates the whole notion of no second acts. That's because The Twilight Zone was the second act. The illustrious first act, of course, was Serling's mighty contributions to television's golden age of the drama anthology. Serling lived such a crowded life. He even managed a post-Twilight Zone third act before his death at 50 on June 28, 1979. June 28, 1975. It featured honored TV movies, screenplays, and his contributions to the NBC horror anthology Night Gallery. None of this would have happened, however, without the landmark work for the live dramas of the 1950s. First published in July 1957, well before anyone had ever heard of The Twilight Zone, this book is representative of that work. It not only contains his two greatest Golden Age scripts, Patterns and Requiem for a Heavyweight, it features Serling's remarkably candid commentary on his writing, on writing for television, and on being a writer. Nothing better than reading about writers who are writing about writing. I like it. I always did. Patterns in Requiem for a Heavyweight make this volume valuable. Serling's engaging introduction and 4 wonderfully frank commentaries make it invaluable. Anyone interested in knowing what made Rod Serling tick should read these sections, word by illuminating word. I will, if you quit talking. Anyone interested in the history of television should read them. I will. Everyone interested in the writing process should read them. I will. Here is an in-the-trenches view of what it was like in those heady days of live television. The challenges, the compromises, the adrenaline rushes, the limitations, the arguments, the rewards. Here is a writer proud of what he accomplished, yet unsparing in his appraisal of where scripts come up short. Here is a young artist challenging himself in the infant medium where he has found a home. Here is a man who sees the possibilities, fully realizing how incredibly difficult they are to attain. Here is a man pushing himself to meet his own high standards, knowing those standards are not measured by how many Emmy Awards they hand you. Here is the path that leads to the Twilight Zone. 2 years before, the frustrations of dealing with sponsors and network censorship drove him into a dimension as vast as space and timeless as infinity. Serling cautioned that live television drama could get stuck in its own creative rut by not fighting for something a little bit better and not looking for something that is new. This is a call to arms for the television industry, for the audience, for the critics, and for himself. After the publication of this book, Serling will go on fighting for something better, and he will do it by finding something fantastically new. I don't know where I'm going, and I'm not sure where I am, he wrote in this book. Submitted for your approval, picture of a writer who has made all of his dreams come true. He is championed by the critics. He has a loving wife and 2 lovely daughters. He has a wide circle of devoted friends. He is about to win his 3rd Emmy. He doesn't know it, but he is at a crossroads. That's the signpost up ahead. His next stop, the Twilight Zone. Before he got there, though, Serling was lionized as one of the writers responsible for putting the gleam on television's so-called golden age. At the height of those heady times, he often was called the medium's angry young man. Yet he doesn't sound angry in these essays or these television plays. He sounds like the Rod Serling we'll get to know in the Twilight Zone, in interviews and Night Gallery. He sounds confident, but that confidence is tempered by the ready admission of nagging doubts and insecurities. He is candid, but that straightforward nature is laced with a sense of irony and a self-deprecating sense of humor. He is dubious, yet underlying his concerns is a strong dose of optimism. You almost can picture Rod grinning at you from behind a hand holding a lit cigarette. That's the absolute joy of his debut book. You get to spend time with Rod, and with 4 of the plays that put him on the map as a writer. Stepping back and looking at the career of an artist, you often can spot that moment of arrival. For Rod Serling, that moment was January 12th, 1955. This was the night of the NBC's Kraft Television Theater aired the live production of Patterns, Serling's riveting play about a young executive hired by the hard-driving, hard-hearted president of a major corporation. A record of what happened that survives thanks to Kinescope, the filming of a television program by setting up a camera in front of a video monitor. The picture quality, as you might imagine, is not the sharpest, but you can plainly see why this drama inspired New York Times critic Jack Gould to write, "Nothing in months has excited the television industry as much as the Kraft Television Theater's production of Patterns, an original play by Rod Serling. The enthusiasm is justified. In writing, acting, and direction, Patterns will stand as one of the high points in the TV medium's evolution. It was an amazingly prophetic evaluation on Mr. Gould's part." The Times reviewer added that, "For sheer power of narrative, forcefulness of characterization, and brilliant climax, Mr. Serling's work is a creative triumph." Serling's assessment. It was good, perhaps better than good. Indeed it was. The cast was superb, led by Richard Kiley, spared no expense, as idealistic Manhattan newcomer Fred Staples. Ed Begley, probably one of the best in the cast, as aging and vulnerable Andy Sloan. And Everett Sloan as ruthless boss Walter Ramsey. Fielder Cook was the talented director for this 463rd presentation of Kraft Television Theater, which started its illustrious run on May 7, 1947, when Serling was 22, attending Antioch College in Ohio and dating education and psychology major Carolyn Louise Kramer. But it was Serling's writing that truly caused a sensation. Old boy was 22. If you die at 50, you got no time to waste. For Serling, this was one of those overnight successes that took years of struggle and patient attention to craft. He had written 71 television scripts before hitting this primetime home run. He was 30 years old. Let's see. Intriguing autobiographical touches can be spotted here and there in patterns. Consciously or not, Rod Serling gave his lead character a name that followed the pattern of his own. Same number of syllables, first name ending in D, last name starting with an S. Okay, so he wrote this at 30. Like Fred Staples, Rod Serling had moved from Cincinnati, where he was pegged as a talented young man with great potential. Like Staples, Serling had a wife supportive of his career choices. Like Staples, he was living in Connecticut. Like Staples, he was doing everything in his power to do good work in a competitive business that often challenged principles and demanded compromise. If Serling's experiences in television didn't shape the plot and themes of patterns, they certainly informed it. Early in the drama, a secretary played by 21-year-old Elizabeth Montgomery, love her, see her in Gore Vidal's, I forget what it's called, Summer something, where a gazebo is a main plot point. You never know when you're going to hit a nerve. Patterns hit a nerve, all right, rocketing Serling to the head of the television star's class of writers. The two writers who most came to symbolize the golden age were Serling and Patty Chayefsky, whose tale of a lonely Bronx butcher, Marty, aired to great acclaim in May 1953. Small wonder they were the first two writers specializing in drama inducted into the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences Hall of Fame. To fully appreciate how and why Rod Serling became a star in the 1950s, you must start with the realization that TV very much needed stars in the 1950s. Can you imagine getting in the ground floor of the birth of television? With this upstart medium sweeping the nation, the major film studios went to war. Television was keeping Americans home with free entertainment, and the studio bosses were fighting to protect their endangered territory. Film stars were told in no uncertain terms that they should not consort with the enemy. Television had little leverage and less money to compete for talent back then, so programmers' answer was to make their own stars. This included writers, and the outgoing, articulate Serling had charisma, drive, and talent to spare. I have never ceased liking publicity, Serling admits in this book. This isn't ego for its own sake, because I don't drop names and I don't purposely seek it, but I still get a kick when I see my name in the paper, and I probably always will. Rod and Patty were in good company. Also contributing distinguished scripts to live dramas were Gore Vidal, wink wink, Horton Foote, J.P. Miller, Tad Mosel, William Gibson, Helen Hanff, Robert Allen Arthur, Reginald Rose, Ernest Kenoy, and Ira Levin, Stepford Wives fame, and Rosemary's Baby. Plays by these writers were stamped with that particular quality that forced recognition. Serling commented, their stories were compelling reasons for Americans to stay home, anxious to see what this new medium had to offer. The medium began to show a cognizance of its own particular fortes, Serling observed. It had the immediacy of the living theater, some of the flexibility of the motion pictures, and the coverage of radio. It utilized all three in developing and improving what was actually a new art form. As indicated previously by the plays on Kraft, Studio One, and Cellini's Theater, one could see that the television play was beginning to show depth and a preoccupation with character. Its plots and its people were becoming meaningful. Its stories had something to say. Patterns had a great deal to say about ambition, competition, talent, success, decency, ethics, power, and the misuse of power. Like Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, it spoke eloquently about the value and dignity of each human life, and the need for that dignity to be recognized. It indicted any culture, that views age and experience as disposable items to be pushed toward the scrap heap. It cautioned the individual to beware of those moments that tempt what Serling called a minimum set of ethics. The dilemma. When he refuses to compromise those ethics, his career must suffer. When he does compromise them, his conscience does the suffering. It's symbolically perfect that this play and this book are titled Patterns, because they establish patterns Serling would follow for the rest of his career. These are themes he would revisit again and again, examining them through an ever-changing prism, altered by age and experience. Fred Staples is climbing the corporate ladder in Patterns. Andy Sloan is on his way down. 4 years later, in one of Serling's best Twilight Zone episodes, 36-year-old business executive Martin Sloan, Gig Young, is wearing of the rat race and yearning for a simpler time in walking distance. Martin Sloan is looking backwards, but if he could see himself a few years in the future, he might be looking at Andy Sloan. Already farther down that road is Garth Williams, James Daly, the main character in another of Serling's exceptional Twilight Zone excursions, A Stop at Willoughby. Hounded by a Ramsay-like "What have you done for me lately, boss?", Garth Williams already knows the demons haunting Andy Sloan. And as Mark Scott Zickrey points out in his excellent book, The Twilight Zone Companion, Serling's finest script for Night Gallery, they're tearing down Tim Riley's bar, is pretty much a companion piece to Patterns and Walking Distance, although I'd add that the stop at Willoughby to this ongoing journey. At 45, Serling told the story of Randy Lane, William Wyndham, a tired, disillusioned business executive desperately trying to hold on to the ladder rungs, but losing his grip nonetheless and slipping down and down. Zickrey rightly notes that this Night Gallery story represents Serling at his best, writing with an insight and power the equal of anything he had done before. Patterns, Walking Distance, and their tearing down Tim Riley's bar offer a progression of what is essentially the same character at different points in his life. Say, Scott Skelton and Jim Benson in their comprehensive book, Rod Serling's Night Gallery, and After Hours Tour. All three characters hold up a mirror to Serling as he responds to the fortunes of his career. Unquestionably true, but the other characters and other pieces, like A Stop at Willoughby, add significant threads to the tapestry. You can follow the path that leads from Fred Staples to Martin Sloan to Randy Lane. You also can trace the thread that takes you from Andy Sloan to Garth Williams to Randy Lane. It's not as clean or direct, perhaps, yet it is no less fascinating. You can just dwell on how the choice of names seem to echo each other. Sloan to Sloan, Andy to Randy. Patterns indeed. These are merely some of the themes you see established in the 4 plays selected by Serling for his first book. There are more, much more, so you can view this volume as both the astonishing fulfillment of a dynamic young talent and the promise of searing works to come. When we first meet Fred Staples in Patterns, he is about to board the elevator that will take him up to the executive offices and into television history. "You've arrived, Mr. Staples," his wife Fran tells him. It could have been Carol Serling telling her husband, You've arrived, Mr. Serling." Yes, he had. The sensation caused by patterns cleared the way for a presentation of Serling's The Rack on the U.S. Steel Hour. 3 months later, on April 12, 1955, and also chosen by Serling for this volume, The Rack was a provocative drama about a mentally tortured American POW accused of collaborating with his North Korean captors. Ooh. A former Army paratrooper scarred physically and emotionally during World War II. Serling wasn't about to make it easy on himself or his audience. He delved into many sides of a thorny issue, managing to make all the viewpoints sympathetic. While impressed, some critics griped that The Rock wasn't another Patterns. It was a complaint that Serling would grow tired of hearing during this typically prolific phase of his career. By and large, I think The Rack is one of the most honest things I have ever written, Serling said in the commentary following the second television play in this book. The third play in the collection, Old MacDonald Had a Curve, actually was aired by Kraft Television Theater before Patterns on August 5th, 1953. It tells of an ex-Major League pitcher, irascible Maxwell Firebrand lefty MacDonald, Olin Howland, who frequently exaggerates his record while charging down memory lane at the Carterville home for the aged. A freak accident leaves Lefty with an unhittable curveball. Although 67, he decides to try out for his old team, the Brooklyn Nationals, who are languishing in last place. The Nationals need a miracle. Lefty needs a new lease on life. Not all of Serling's comedies sailed out of the strike zone, so to speak. Such delightful Twilight Zone episodes as Night of the Meek and Mr. Garrity and the Graves are whimsical proof of that. But he had a surer hand with drama, and Old MacDonald Had a Curve is the slightest of the four works in this book. That's not to say typo. It says that's not say. That doesn't make sense. That's not to say it's a bad script. It is, in fact, a charming, life-affirming tale that happily foreshadows the fantasy flourishes of the Twilight Zone. Looking for more Patterns? Again, indulging his great love of baseball, Serling reworked this idea for The Mighty Casey, a first-season episode of The Twilight Zone. This time, a robot seemingly was the answer to a miserable team's prayers. But in both, the long-suffering manager is named Mouth McGarry. Jack Warden is featured in both. I think it did show, even at this relatively early date, something of my later preoccupation with the age-youth problem. So obvious in Patterns, Serling wrote in the commentary for Old MacDonald Had a Curve. We already know it would continue to be a preoccupation. Still, any teleplay would suffer in comparison to the other three in this volume. Serling almost certainly concluded it as something of a change-up pitch for the collection, and, as such, it works very well. It fully justifies his own judgment. Old MacDonald was fun to write, and I think it was fun to watch. It's also fun to read. If 1955 was the year of arrival for Rod Serling, the following year was what confirmed his stature as an important new writer. There were film versions of Patterns, with Sloane, Begley, and Van Heflin replacing Kiley as Fred, and The Rack with Paul Newman in the role played by Marshall Thompson on television. On March 17th, 1956, Serling won the first of his 6 Emmys. It was, of course, for Patterns. And on October 11th, 1956, Playhouse 90 premiered one of the most triumphant dramas ever written or ever will be written for television, Requiem for a Heavyweight. Let me take a drink. What the fuck? I watched that one too. This is Serling summoning all of his considerable powers and delivering the knockout blow. He worried that his career would always be defined by Patterns, measured by it. While The Wreck was greatly admired by many critics, Serling still was that guy who wrote patterns. Requiem for a Heavyweight was stirring proof that the writer could reach back and throw an even more devastating dramatic punch. It was proof, as Serling said, that Patterns was not a happy accident. During his army days, Serling had climbed into the ring for 18 bouts, winning 17 of them. He earned an appreciation of the sweet science and a broken nose. Requiem for a Heavyweight is the story of Harlan Mountain McClintock, a one-time contender on his way to Punchyland. The doctor says his fighting days are done, but he only knows boxing. Meanwhile, his manager, Maish, is deep in debt. Absorbing horrific punishment in his last fight, Mountain managed to stay on his feet until the 7th round. Maish bet that his aging fighter wouldn't last 3 rounds. Now, a desperate Maish is pushing the proud Mountain to become a wrestler. Mountain's loyal handler, an ex-boxer named Army, knows hurt more than any punch. As battered as he is, Mountain is holding on to the dignity of a bruiser who never threw a fight and always gave Maish and fight fans everything he had. Now Maish wants to strip away whatever dignity is left. "You're not a winner anymore, Mountain," Maish tells the washed-up fighter, who has left so much of himself behind in smoke-filled arenas. "And that means there's only one thing left. Make a little off the losing." Everything fell into place for this 3-act Playhouse 90 drama. Jack Palance, stunningly convincing as the thick-voiced Pug, didn't make a wrong move as Mountain. There are times in the career of a writer when a single performance in a play can add such a fantastic dimension and moving quality that the role appears to have been molded into the actor's shape. Serling wrote of Palance's portrayal. "I agree, he did a good job. I never saw a young Jack Palance like that. I don't know if it was one of his first works. It's really good. I recommend it." Keenan Wynn, so memorable as defense attorney Steve Wozniak in The Wreck, found all the many levels Serling envisioned in the deeply conflicted Maish. Wynn's father, comedian Ed Wynn, overcame a shaky rehearsal period to deliver a moving performance as the sympathetic Army. And Kim Hunter, Streetcar fame, made the most of every moment on screen as Grace, the social worker trying to help Mountain. While the characteristically self-critical Serling thought Grace could have been better drawn, she couldn't have been better played. I agree. She did a good job. More than a good job. She does... When I say good, I mean great. The sets, Ralph Nelson's direction, the pacing, it all clicked. Towering above all, however, was Serling's writing, properly recognized with the Emmy for Best Teleplay on March 16, 1957. Requiem for a Heavyweight also won the Emmys for Program of the Year, Best Single Performance by an Actor, Palance, and Best Direction. A film version appeared in 1962 with Anthony Quinn, Jackie Gleason, Mickey Rooney, and Julie Harris. Holy shit. That's a lineup, eh? Like the film adaptation of Patterns, it was good, but not as good as what aired on television. So the scripts for Patterns and Requiem for a Heavyweight are the tent poles at either end of this collection, representing Serling at the very top of his game as a writer and pushing a new medium toward the possibilities of becoming a true art form. In 1958, Serling won his 3rd consecutive writing Emmy, this one for The Comedian. Also an excellent play. His Playhouse 90 adaptation of Ernest Lehman's novella about a bullying, egomaniacal television comedian played by Rooney. Perfect casting. Edmund O'Brien, Kim Hunter, and Mel Torme also were cast. Side note, I did not know that Mel Torme acted. I knew him only as a composer of Christmas, not carols, but songs. He did a great job as an emotional punching bag for Mickey Rooney. Just as Serling would return to the baseball diamond for The Mighty Casey, he would revisit the boxing ring for The Big Tall Wish, another first-season episode of The Twilight Zone. A 5th-season episode by Richard Matheson, Steele, has a futuristic requiem ring to it, although here the manager is the one put through the ringer. Looking forward to the Twilight Zone and Night Gallery, you can see dozens of specific casting connections, as well as those many thematic threads. Warden, who also starred in Serling's outstanding first-season Twilight Zone episode, The Lonely, wouldn't be the only actor from one of these 4 plays to appear in future Serling projects. Pattern star Everett Sloane had top billing in Serling's The Fever, a first-season episode of The Twilight Zone. Richard Kiley, spared no expense, starred in Escape Route, one of the 3 Serling stories in the 1969 Night Gallery movie. Elizabeth Montgomery of Bewitched and Lizzie Borden fame was featured in writer-director Montgomery Pittman's 2, which opened the 3rd season of The Twilight Zone. Ed Wynn starred in 2 Twilight Zone installments, Serling's One for the Angels and Richard DeRoy's reworking of a George Clayton Johnson story, 90 Years Without Slumbering. That's a hell of a title. And Keenan Wynn had the lead in the episode that ended the first season of The Twilight Zone, Matheson's comedy A World of His Own. Looking for themes that will recur in Serling's work, you'll be able to identify many of what he might have called preoccupations. The fundamentally decent person tossed into the middle of a morally ambiguous situation. The worn-out professional coping with dissatisfaction, obsolescence, or just being forgotten. The aging warrior striving to keep on his feet as the ground is being cut out from under him. The worth of an individual. Yeah. The yearning for simpler times. The enduring spirit battling to survive under the merciless assault of forces beyond one beleaguered person's control. Those are themes, all right. Make me a little melancholy because of how true they are. Again and again, Serling will be drawn to the individual faced with a moral crisis, a midlife crisis, a crisis of quiet desperation. We've all been there, or will be there, and it's this recognition that makes Serling's writing so incredibly timely and timeless. I agree. That's the continuing magic of Serling's stories. Some writers' work seems as fresh and as relevant as the day it first appeared. Their writing transcends eras and fashions. This is yet another comparison point between Rod Serling and Mark Twain, 2 distinctly American writers who enjoyed spending summers with their families at beloved upstate New York retreats. Twain at his sister-in-law's quarry farm in Elmira, Serling at Lake Cayuga Cottage near Ithaca. Serling's work, as this collection so forcefully demonstrates, was incredibly relevant when it was first produced. It remains incredibly relevant today, and it will be relevant 500 years from now, when the Twilight Zone is being shown on some distant planet where humans have taken a slight step into the galaxy. Serling was very much a man of his time, becoming a part of an emerging medium at a fortunate moment when he could fully explore his passions and exploit his abilities. Fortunate for him. Fortunate for us. It was the ideal place and time for Serling, who recognized the possibilities and seized them. But the best of his writing, from Patterns to They're tearing down Tim Riley's bar, has a quality best described by those 3 words Serling penned for a Twilight Zone introduction: timeless as infinity. I've been a television critic for more than 30 years. And during that time, I've interviewed dozens upon dozens of writers and producers, responsible for hours and hours of superlative television. The writer most named as an inspiration, a profound influence, and a hero is Rod Serling. These are not just writers specializing in science fiction, horror, and fantasy. These are writers of all kinds. They responded to their hero's declaration, "For us, the heartening thing is that there are still things to strive for." They are the artists who heard Serling's challenge to fight for something a little bit better. And like the hero of Requiem for a Heavyweight, Rod kept fighting, kept swinging. He had the boxer's mentality. You don't keep swinging. Jesus. Okay, backtrack. He had the boxer's mentality. You don't stop swinging. You keep throwing leather until the man rings the bell, ending the fight. Or the man counts 10. There is something deeply heroic about how he kept fighting. The whirlwind energy and social conscience that powered script after script reminds one of President Benjamin Harrison's description of a young Theodore Roosevelt. He wanted to put an end to all the evil in the world between sunrise and sunset. Serling knew he couldn't put an end to evil, injustice, ignorance, prejudice, greed, and cruelty, but he could blast away at them with every weapon in his writer's arsenal, every storytelling tool at his disposal. One more Mark Twain parallel. In 2009, Hal Holbrook addressed a group of Twain scholars assembled at Elmira College. "We need someone to tell us the truth," he said. "Not twist it, not make it their own territory, but to tell us the truth." That's also why we still need Rod Serling. 60 years after the airing of Patterns, it's why we'll continue to need him. So that was the foreword. What to say. Gore Vidal, I always go back to Gore, was talking about himself being at a crossroads and what to do with his life. And he was making a very kind of binary setup for himself between being a writer and being a politician. And I'm going to probably butcher this quote. I'm paraphrasing it. The job of a writer is always to tell the truth, and the job of a politician is never to give the game away. So when forced with this proposition, what do you choose? And he went with the former because he wanted to tell the truth. Whether or not he did that, whether or not that was his truth, is another thing. But I think more often than not, he called it like he saw it. And that could be construed as the truth. Again, I've seen Patterns and Requiem for a Heavyweight. I recommend both. Let's see. Writing for television. Oh my. I don't know that I can read all this. But do I want to split this up? I'm at 47 minutes. Let's see. I'll read a little bit and see how far I get. I need to blow my nose. Whoever's listening, thanks for listening. Let me blow my nose and take a break for a second. Before I start, I'll say that I saw Patterns maybe 2 years ago. I rented a Criterion Collection Golden Age of Television box set where there was 6 plays, or 6 adaptations of plays, and Patterns was one of them. And I chose that because I guess I'll be honest, it had the Criterion label on it, and I was curious. And second, because plays were kind of what brought me back to movies. And I thought, well, and I was reading the back, and I thought, well, I'll give it a try. And I saw it had like Mickey Rooney and Piper Laurie and Paul Newman and all these like giants of the day. And Rod Steiger and oh god, I forget, Jack Palance, Kim Hunter, Mel Torme, all these fucking giants. And I didn't care for all the works, but for the most part, I was blown away. I thought these plays were fantastic. I thought the performances were fantastic, and like Mark was writing in that foreword, they are timeless and they are still relevant. And who's that loudmouth blowhard on CNN? in a is that all of them? That loud guy that like shouts at the TV, CNN guy that shouts at TV. What's his name? Let's see what Google. No, that guy at like I don't know. One of the guys was sitting with Gore. I think it's in the United States of Amnesia documentary. Was sitting with Gore talking about a sense of justice, The Best Man, and how it was still relevant. And when you're writing it at a time that's completely different from modern time, what we call modern times, that can either be a good thing or a bad thing. And Gore responded kind of in abject horror about, isn't it bad that it's still relevant? Corruption in politics will never not be relevant, I believe. But anyway, what I'm getting at was I was blown away by Patterns when I saw it. And it kind of made me buy this book, if I'm going to be honest. And I haven't read the play in its entirety, but I'm reading the foreword and about writing for television to you now. So let's dive in. About writing for television. Put my glasses on. There is probably no single absolute anyone can use as a yardstick to describe the nature of the television writer, his background, his fortes, or the nature of his advent into the realm of television writing, save for this simple statement that there are no absolutes. The TV writer is never trained to be a TV writer. There are no courses, however specialized and applied, that will catapult him into the profession. And it was especially true back in the twilight days of radio that coincided with the primitive beginnings of television that the television playwrights evolved and were never born. In my case, the decision to become a television writer arose from no professional master plan. I'm assuming this is Rod's own words. I should have prefaced that before. So this is Rod speaking, unless I find otherwise. Let's see. I was on the writing staff of a radio station in the Midwest. Holla. Staff writing is a particularly dreamless occupation characterized by assembly line writing almost around the clock. It is a highly variable occupation, everything from commercials and 15-second public service announcements, PSAs, to half-hour documentary dramas. In a writing sense, it serves its purpose. It teaches a writer discipline, a time sense for any kind of mass media writing, and a technique. But it also dries up his creativity, frustrates him, and tires him out. We're going to go with he, him, proverbial. It's axiomatic that the beginning freelance writer must have some sort of economic base from which he operates. Usually it is a job with at least a subsistence wage to give him rent money and 3 square meals a day, while he begins the treacherous and highly unsure first months of writing on his own. The most desirable situation encompasses an undemanding job that draws little out of the writer's mind during the working day, so that his nocturnal writing will be fresh, inspired, and undiverted. In my case, this was a wish, but never a reality. Yeah, how can you write at night when you're spending all day writing for somebody else? I used to come home at 7 o'clock in the evening, gulp down a dinner, and set up my antique portable typewriter on the kitchen table. The first hour would then be spent closing all the mental gates and blacking out all the impressions of a previous 8 hours of writing. Okay, I'm sitting here thinking the kitchen table is like the perfect writing space because it's so big. And I was thinking of him sitting down there. What am I doing? I want to read that again. The first hour would then be spent closing all the mental gates and blacking out all the impressions of a previous 8 hours of writing. So the guy wrote all day. He came home, ate dinner, and hopefully spent a little bit of time with his wife, and then set up shop, and then spent an hour trying to get everything quiet and open his mind up to his own writing. Okay. You have to have a pretty selective brain for this sort of operation. Yeah. There has to be the innate ability to single track the creative processes. And after a year or so of this kind of problem, you have rent receipts, fuel for the furnace, and a record of regular eating. But you have also denied yourself, as I did, a basic must for every writer. And this is simple solitude, physical and mental, which is why I don't understand why people get married and have kids and then decide to do something like this, but I digress. The process of writing cannot be juggled with another occupation. The job of creating well, that's easy for you to say. The job of creating cannot be compartmentalized, with certain hours devoted to one kind of creation and other hours set aside for still another. Writing is a demanding profession and a selfish one. And because it is selfish and demanding, because it is compulsive and exacting, I didn't embrace it. I succumbed to it. I can pinpoint the day and almost the hour that it happened for me. After 2 years of double shift writing, I had made approximately 6 sales to network television programs. They weren't bad scripts. There was usually a kind of strength to them that showed in dialogue and a sense of character, but they were stamped with a lack of professional polish. They showed in many ways that they were done on a kitchen table during the 11th and 12th and 13th hours of a working day. They were always sharpened, but never to their finest points. So on a midwinter day, I gave in to freelance writing. This was not the overtly courageous plunge that some writers make. In any case, I had just finished a 3-week assignment as a staff radio writer, planning a documentary series designed to honor certain towns and cities in the listening area. In regional radio, adjoining localities are forever being honored. This is designed to make for excellent public relations, but it is only on rare occasions that it makes for even a modicum of good listening. In most cases, the towns I was assigned to honor had little to distinguish them save antiquity. Any dramatization beyond the fact that they existed physically usually had one major industry. A population and a founding date was more fabrication than documentation. I had just turned in a sample script to the program director that was essentially above and beyond the call of duty, and well beyond the call of truth. My script called for a narrator and a 30-piece live orchestra, and contained the kind of prose that made Green Hills, Ohio look like the Alamo. When I was called into the PD's office, my script was lying face down on his desk, like a thumb in a Roman arena. He leaned back in his swivel chair and studied me pensively, as if searching for some velvet glove language that could be utilized to castigate me without breaking my spirit. "Serling," he said, "it's this way. Your stuff's too stilted. You seem to be missing the common touch. We're looking for grassroots here. We want to be close to the people. We're obliged to use the folksy approach. In short, we want our people to get their teeth into the soil." As he was talking, I knew exactly what he meant. The folksy approach did not include a 30-piece orchestra or prose out of Norman Corwin's On a Note of Triumph. It needed only 2 elements: a hayseed MC who strummed a guitar and said, "Shucks, friends," and a girl yodeler whose falsetto could break a beer mug at 20 paces. This was getting the teeth into the soil, and the little thought journeyed through my brain that what these guys wanted was not a writer but a plow. During the next couple of hours, 2 things occurred to form and then cement a resolve of mine. The staff writer, in addition to writing, acts also as a kind of roving idea man for several current and varied types of programs. One of my duties was to supply gimmicks for an afternoon ladies' show. That afternoon, I stopped by the studio to watch the tail end of one of its performances. The master of ceremonies was a semi-literate ex-tent revivalist with curly hair and an absolutely devastating smile. He was winding up his show with a 3-minute sermon on the boys in Korea and how we should pray for them. The ladies in the audience were totally captivated. There wasn't a dry eye in the studio. The program went off the air, and the MC, his eyes half closed, walked softly out of the studio. past the sighs and fluttering eyelashes of the good lady come to see him and who now stared worshipfully and respectfully up at him. I bet he loved that. He nodded to me, and we both got on the elevator. It went down one floor, and the girl got off. The wavy head went up. The look of soulful ecstasy left the broad and dimpled face. He winked at me, nudged my elbow, and said, "I wonder if she lays." Saw that one coming. The same fat-faced, sanctimonious slob had told me earlier that he used to travel with his father, who was also an itinerant evangelist. But at the time, he said his father did the preaching, and he was the one who made the money. He had the Bible concession. 2 hours later, I got my next assignment to dream up an audition show for a patent medicine currently the rage. It had about 12% alcohol by volume, and if the testimonials were to be believed, could cure everything from arthritis to a fractured pelvis. I spent 2 minutes studying the agency's worksheet, which stated the general purpose of the program. I read as far as the second paragraph. This will be a program for the people. We'd like to see a real grassroots approach that is popular and close to the soil. The pattern of whatever future I had was very much in evidence. I was either going to write dramatic shows for television, even at the risk of economics and common sense, or I was going to succumb to the double-faced sanctimony of commercial radio, rotating words as if they were crops, and utilizing one of the approaches so characteristic to radio, writing and thinking downward at the lowest possible common denominator of an audience. That afternoon, I quit the radio station. I sat that night with my wife, Carol, at a Howard Johnson's restaurant and a few false starts. You know, honey, a man could make a lot of money freelancing. I talked out my hope. Freelance writing would no longer be a kind of errant hope to augment our economy, to be done around the midnight hour on a kitchen table. Freelance writing would now be our bread, our butter, and the now or never of our whole existence. My wife was 21, 3 months pregnant, and a most adept reader of the score. Okay, so I want to break here and say, I said previously, I don't know why people do this. Maybe that was the extra push he needed to push himself to full capacity. Because those are pretty high stakes when you got a wife and to-be kid depending on you. It's a gamble. She knew all about freelance writing. She'd lived it with me through college and the 2 years afterward. She knew that in my best year I had netted exactly $790. She was well aware that it was a hit-or-miss profession where the lush days are followed by the lean. Peaks and valleys, showbiz. It's a gambling life, don't you know? She knew it was seasonal, and there was no definition of the seasons. She knew that it was a frustrating, insecure, bleeding business at best, and the guy she was married to could get his pride, his composure, and his confidence eaten away with the acid of disappointment. And he still got knocked up by him, girl. All this she knew, sitting at a table in Howard Johnson's in 1951, but you stood by him. And, as it turned out, this was a scene with no dialogue at all. All she did was to take my hand. And she winked at me and picked up a menu and studied it. Okay. I want to say that all this yammering I'm doing about how a writer should be alone, I still agree with. But to have a significant other whom you proposed a risk and like take your hand to say that I'm with you. That's pretty precious. She stood by her man. Not everybody has that. And at that given moment, the vision of medicine bottles, girl yodelers, and guitar strumming MCs faded away into happy obscurity. For less or lean, good or bad, sardies or malnutrition, I'd launched a career. I'll grant you the perhaps inordinate amount of sentiment attached to all the above, but if this were a novel, Patent Medicine's Howard Johnson and my wife Carol would all be a part of an obligatory first chapel. Fuck yeah, it would. This was the nature of television in 1951. It was a good gamble, dude. The medium had progressed somewhat past the primitive stage. There was still a sense of bewilderment on the part of everyone connected with the shows, and it was still more the rule than the exception to find the opening camera shot of almost every television play trained on the behind of one of the cameramen. But by this time there were 6 half-hour live shows that came out of New York, and two or three one-hour shows. On the there were a dozen or more filmed half-hour anthologies. The television writer's claim to the title playwright had been made, but as yet was not universally accepted. The TV play, once called by Paddy Chayefsky the most perishable item known to man, but you made a living, enjoyed no longevity through the good offices of the legitimate stage and the motion pictures. I still know your name, Paddy. The motion picture industry looked down at its newborn cousin somewhat as the president of a gourmet club might examine an aborigine gnawing a slab of raw meat. The movie people had no way of knowing at the time that this bumbling, inexpert baby medium would one day compete with them and come dangerously close to destroying them. Prophetic. For at that time, the television play went on and off the air with few cheers and with no one to mourn its passing. The video diet was a lean mixture of wrestling and occasional football. These were the days of the 10-inch screen, the 1931 movies, and Gorgeous George. The television dramas extant were still in the process of feeling their way around, trying to find some kind of level of performance, some reason for being, and some set of techniques. At the time, there existed no species referred to exclusively as television writers. There were radio writers who were extending themselves a bit, realists who knew that the golden days of radio drama were dimming into twilight. There were screenwriters doing television films as a stopgap between picture assignments. Smart. There were also some embryonic playwrights who used the new medium as a kind of finger exercise for what they hoped would turn into legitimate writing later on. But neither the industry nor the public was prone to make any association between writing of real quality and the sort of thing done for television. My first television script had been sold in the early 1950s to an NBC film series on the coast called Stars Over Hollywood. It was brave and adventuresome. Beyond this, the production and conception of the program was symptomatic of absolutely the worst features of Class B movie making. The plots were an ABC mishmash with the depth and levels of an Adobe hut. Jesus, I can't read. I need a drink. The performances were rarely ever able to overcome the scripts. The piece I sold them was called Grady Everett for the People. It starred Bert Freed, who turned in a pretty fair performance, considering everything. I don't recall too clearly the essence of the story or the way it was done, but I have a vivid recollection of the payment involved. It was exactly $100 for all television rights. I never met anyone connected with this production, nor did I set foot in the studio. But as of this writing, it has been on at least 24 times at odd hours and on odd channels. I will claim immodestly that it surpassed wrestling. Beyond that, I'll make no value judgment whatsoever. The singularly distinguishing feature of television drama in those early days was a paucity of payment, sets, and theme. And to go along with this was a bleak desert which represented the area of identity of the television writer. He was practically anonymous. He had an ill-defined respect for his talents and no protection at all for his work. He had few prerogatives in terms of its production and only the barest of recognition for his contribution. The Kraft Television Theater, the oldest of the one-hour dramatic shows, wouldn't permit a writer at rehearsal until the day of the show. His presence at that late hour was probably a guarantee against intrusion. For by then the lines had already been changed, the interpretations made, the blocking in camera arranged. The writer could protest, but only as a gesture. The show was a fait accompli prior to his arrival, or a fait accompli. In the kindred areas of rewriting, casting music at all, the writer had even less to say. I cite the Kraft Theater as an example not to single it out for a necessarily unique mistreatment of authors, but because it was one of the few dramatic programs existent at the time. It aimed for quality and often achieved it. This was the show that did things like Moliere's A Doctor in Spite of Himself, Ibsen's A Dollhouse, Galsworthy's Justice and Loyalties. It also produced plays like Valley Forge, Berkeley Square, Comedy of Errors, and Macbeth. And some of these shows were produced as early as 1947. The reader can pretty much gather what the policies of the lesser programs were with regard to their conception and treatment of the men and women who wrote the material. These first 4 and 5 years of television were the cradle days of a baby whose birth may not have been accidental, but whose process of maturing was far from being planned. But thanks to programs like Kraft and some others, television was expanding its technique and coverage, and along with it came an expansion in quality. Besides Kraft, there was Studio One. Tony Miner, a pioneer without coonskin, was producing the plays on Studio One, whose expanse was becoming as much horizontal as vertical. One of his productions took place on a submarine. He used actual water and a mock-up submarine, and he did it on a nickel-and-dime budget that today wouldn't pay for a cast on a half-hour show. It evolved as a striking and powerfully realistic illusion, and it pointed the way to a new horizon in live television. Celanese Theater, I don't know if I'm saying that right, went on the air and did things like Maxwell Anderson's Winter Set, and it did them well and effectively. Celanese was directed by a man named Alex Siegel, who became one of the early names in television. He was later to direct some television plays by Rod Serling, who at the time of Alex's arrival on the television scene was still writing prayer messages for an extant revivalist in Ohio. But at this moment in the evolution of television drama, there were even a few intellectual diehards who began to see the potential of it, and began to realize that a television play could come close to the legitimate theater, and even surpass it sometimes in terms of flexibility. Along with television's expansion and progress came the birth of a new school of television actors and actresses, men and women associated with the medium and known because of it. Like Hollywood and Broadway before it, television began to produce its own stars. And also like Hollywood and Broadway, the writer was the last of the company to achieve an identity. To his everlasting credit, he did it on his own. The networks financed no campaign to make Chayefsky a known and a sociable quantity. Several million viewers began to make that association on their own. Plays by Paddy Chayefsky, Horton Foote, Bob Arthur, David Swift, and David Shaw were stamped with that particular quality that forced recognition. The programs and networks helped, of course. The medium was improving to a point where it allowed them to help. They began to supply the financial and technical aid to enlarge the scope of the television drama. Now, a writer could conceive of a story that played on more than 2 sets with more than 4 actors. He could write with an eye toward the fluidity of movement that came with 3 cameras. His sets and costumes were no longer slapped together as incidental accoutrement to a one-shot performance. They were given thought, preparation, and time. But the major advance in the television play was a thematic one. The medium began to show a cognizance of its own particular fortes. It had the immediacy of the living theater, some of the flexibility of the motion picture, and the coverage of radio. It utilized all 3 in developing and improving what was actually a new art form. As indicated previously by the plays on Kraft, Studio One, and Celanese Theater, one could see that the television play was beginning to show depth and a preoccupation with character. Its plots and its people were becoming meaningful. Its stories had something to say. There was a flavor to it well beyond the early Hollywood half-hour film, which shoved a product out that was obviously molded at an early age and became moldy at a late one. This product was sprinkled with a kiss, a gunshot, a dab of sex, a final curtain clinch, and it was called drama. Parenthetically, it might be stated here that Hollywood did little to help in the evolution and improvement of television as a medium, at least in terms of drama. What accolades are deserved here should go to Chicago and New York. In terms of technique, the close-up that had served as such a boon to the motion picture was further refined and used to even greater advantage in television. The key to TV drama was intimacy, and the facial study on a small screen carried with it a meaning and a power far beyond its usage in the motion pictures. I can't forget, for example, the endearing passage in Paddy Chayefsky's Marty, between Marty and the girl and the little all-night beanery. This scene was a close-up of the two through the entire playing. What? This scene was a close-up of the two through the entire playing. This scene was a close-up of the two through the entire playing. Okay. And the wonderfully fabulous thing of two lonely people finding each other was played on the two faces. Rod Steiger and Nancy Marchand. I am also reminded of one of my own things, a totally different piece from Marty, but one which utilized the same kind of television technique that was so uniquely television. This was The Strike, produced on Studio One in June 1954. There was a moment in the play when Major Gaylord, extremely well played by James Daly, was recounting an experience during World War II when he was obliged to fire on an American soldier in the dead of night on a Pacific island. The camera stayed tight on his face for almost 3 solid minutes, and we had a moving, poignant, and almost heart-rending picture of the fatigue and fear that go hand in hand in the province of wartime combat. The physical and the fates conspired to force the maturing of the television drama. It was no longer a novelty. It had become a fixture. As such, it competed with every other kind of entertainment. Consequently, it was forced to become better, to become different, and to aim higher. It was a medium a 1-hour time period could play to an audience greater than a Broadway play reached in one solid year of SRO crowds. With this kind of potential and with this kind of impetus, however young, however groping, television was something to be reckoned with. Television today remains a study in imperfection. Some of its basic weaknesses and mediocrity are still with us. There is still wrestling, soap opera, overlong commercials, and some incredibly bad writing. There is really no defense for any of this, but there is an explanation. You need only look at a calendar to remember that only 7 or 8 years have gone by, and the medium remains a young one and a groping one. There still remain new techniques to learn, new fields to examine, and a myriad set of roadblocks to progress that still have to be breached. But there is still time, and there are still ways. Radio was around 20-odd years before it really found its niche, and ultimately wrote out affinity to its potential. Television hasn't exhausted its potential or altogether found its niche, and in the area of drama it has already far surpassed that of its sister medium. Like any mass medium, it might still die from internal strangulation. But for those of us who professionally cast our lot with it in its early days, we haven't yet given up. For us, the heartening thing is that there are still things to strive for. Okay, so it doesn't say when he wrote this. I'm looking at the back. Yeah, it doesn't give a time and date, but if he says it's 7 or 8 years since it started, I'm guessing he wrote this in the late 50s, possibly. I don't know, just a guess. I'm going to take a drink. Again, thanks you guys for joining me, whomever it is. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, it doesn't give a date when the essay was written. But onward. Let's see if I can round this out. I don't have how many pages are left, but let's keep going. A few recollections. A writer, at least this writer, measures his career not so much in terms of years as in individual moments. They are the good moments, the big sale, the well-received show, the award at the end of the year. The television playwright must savor his success and his good moments very hurriedly, because they're temporal at best. But the bad moments, his failures, the script rejections, the incisively bad reviews, cling to him with much more tenacity and for longer periods than the moderate successes. Between late 1951 and 1954, I lived in Ohio, commuting back and forth to New York to take part in story conferences and the rehearsals of my shows. This was expensive and time-consuming, but was a concession to my own peculiar hesitancy about all things big, massive, and imposing. New York television and its people were such an entity. For some totally unexplainable reason, every time I walked into a network or agency office, I had a strange and persistent feeling that I was wearing overalls and little Abner shoes. Big boys in big cities, Serling. Mucky mucks. I remember one incident during those early days when I had flown into New York to discuss a rewrite on a script called You Be the Bad Guy, which starred MacDonald Carey. The script editor, Dick McDonough, asked if I'd like to meet the star of the show. I was ushered into a small office where the cast was assembled for the reading, and there was introduced to Mr. Carey, who turned out to be an extremely pleasant, affable guy, who stood up and shook my hand and complimented me on the script. I remember standing in the center of the room wondering what the hell I could do next, and deciding that I had outworn my welcome and my purpose and should at this time beat a retreat. I looked busily and professionally at my watch, nodded tersely to all assembled, mumbled something about it being a pleasure to see them all, but that I had to catch a plane going west, and then turned and crashed into the wall, missing the door by 2 feet. He ran into the wall, y'all, because he was nervous. Then, in backing out of the room, I ran into an oncoming secretary and dropped my briefcase. Oof! Exposing not only scripts and writing material, but a couple of pairs of socks, some handkerchiefs, and some underwear. Rod was really nervous. It's okay. I traveled light in those days. My exit from the J. Walter Thompson offices that day could not have been more pointed and obvious had it been staged by Max Liebman. But as a postscript to the story, I remember Dick McDonough gripping my hand before I left the building and saying, "Look, little friend, these people don't give a good, healthy damn what you carry in your briefcase or how you leave a room. All they care about is what's in there." He pointed at my head. And he slapped me on the back, wished me well, and I headed back to the airport and Ohio. So you can run into a wall, drop your briefcase, expose your underwear, and still be okay. On a writer's way up, he meets and does business with a lot of people. In some rare cases, there's a person along the way who happens to be around just when he's needed. Perhaps just a moment of professional advice, a brief compliment to boost the ego when it's been bent, cracked, and pushed into the ground, a pat on the back and 8 words of encouragement when a writer's self-doubts are so persistent, so deep-rooted, and so destructive that they affect his writing. Dick McDonough gave me many moments and several words of encouragement and enough pats on the back to keep me propelled forward. He once told me that there might be a day when he'd be reading some of my plays in a book anthology. He may know very well by now how prophetic were his words, but I wonder if he also realizes how instrumental he was in having it happen. Nice. The writer in any field, and particularly the television writer, runs into dry periods. Weeks or months when it seems that everything he writes goes the rounds and ultimately gets nowhere. This is not only a bad moment, but an endless one. I remember a 5-month period late in 1952 when my diet consisted chiefly of black coffee and fingernails. He died at 50, babe. I'd written 6 half-hour television plays, and each one had been rejected at least 5 times. What this kind of thing does to a family budget is obvious, and what it does to the personality of the writer is even worse. The typewriter on my desk was no longer a helpmate. It took on the guise of an opponent. The keys seemed stiff and unyielding. The carriage seemed bulky and sluggish, and the wastepaper basket would get crammed by the hour with discarded pages. A testimonial to my unsureness as to what to write and how to write it. Toward the end of this, I got a letter from Mr. Worthington Minor. I've mentioned Tony Minor earlier. Then as now, he was a major league, top-drawer television producer. And to get a letter from him, particularly a letter asking to see scripts, was like a third-string Pony League pitcher getting a telegram from John McGraw telling him to come up and pitch for the Giants. I flew into New York to see him, my briefcase bulging with manuscripts. There wasn't even room for socks. I wonder if he had underwear. Tony read them, and during our second meeting informed me that he'd like to buy at least 6 of them. He was putting together a new show to be sponsored by an auto company, and my work impressed him. The feeling I got in that given moment was something akin to what a person feels when he is notified that he's just won the Irish sweepstakes. It's very innocent. The knees began to give out, and there's a roar that begins someplace deep down in the gut and starts to travel toward the throat. 15 minutes later, I was on the telephone calling my wife and guzzling a scotch on the rocks I ordered from room service, tipping the bellboy a whole $1, and adding up in my mind how much are 6 times 6 or $700. 1 week later, back in Ohio, I got another letter from Tony Minor apologizing and explaining that the show he was putting together had been shunted off to another agency and he would not be producing it. The guy who had won the Irish sweepstakes couldn't find his ticket stub. It was that kind of feeling. For some perverse reason, I saved Tony's second letter. My wife put it into a scrapbook. And sometimes I take a look at it as a piece of memorabilia to document a bad moment that, on the scale of a career's ups and downs, represents the bottom of the barrel. A writer's career is studded with the near sales, the close hits, the almost but never wases. And afterward, when he becomes accustomed to eating a little higher off the hog, the bad moments get remembered. And no matter what you eat, it tastes like pheasant under glass. Besides the good and the bad moments in a career of writing, there is also an indefinable, hard-to-peg turning point. A crossing of the Rubicon when suddenly you find your name somewhat known in the agencies and on the networks. I need a drink. I imagine that's like an ecstatic feeling, an amazing feeling, but also a terrifying one. The stakes keep getting raised. Oh my. Let's see. You announce it at the reception desk, and the girl nods knowingly and doesn't ask you to repeat it or query you as to its spelling. Exactly when this happens and how, you're never quite sure, but it does happen. Afterward, the process of writing is never any simpler. The ideas are never easier to come by, and your craft and technique don't seem appreciably altered. But there is a difference, as if the long grind upward levels out a little bit and the going becomes a little easier. In my case, it happened because of a single show that emanated live out of New York City. This was the Lux Video Theater. Over a 2-year period, they bought 12 of my shows and produced 11 of them. Pretty damn good. Lux had gone the way of so many dramatic shows. They moved west, went into an hour form, and in this case began to use old movie properties instead of originals. But in its New York half-hour days, the Lux Video Theater proved itself symptomatic of the basic difference between what was Hollywood television and what was then New York City television. It was a show that consistently aimed high. Its whole conception in terms of dialogue and production was adult, never hackneyed, and almost always honest. It touched upon themes like dope and marital infidelity. It did things like adaptations of short stories by Faulkner and Binet. It encouraged the submission of original scripts by any writer who knew how to write, regardless of what his credits were. The definitive characteristic of this show was that it never got rutted into a type program. It was never a till death do us part marriage between the policy of the program and the type of story and ending. The most meaningful and probably the most valuable thing that I can say about the Lux Video Theater is applicable to all of television. On the basis of individual shows, it was as often unsuccessful as it was successful, but it always tried. And though its sights were sometimes aimed higher than its capabilities, it was rarely dull. If this could be said of the entire medium, flags could be raised on all the antennae. Oh, man. All right. Next essay. The problem areas. Defensiveness in a television writer is a kind of occupational disease. His newfound stature has been somewhat therapeutic in combating it, but it remains in varying degrees. A writer is still thought of in some circles as a hack, plain and simple. His work is still regarded by some as merely an appendage to a sales message, and the medium he writes for is still maligned as being principally a display case and not an art form. Jesus. No respect. Rod Serling, Rodney Dangerfield. The TV writer falls prey to some of his criticism because he deserves it. A sizable bulk of television writing still must be dismissed as inconsequential or simply bad stuff, but there also exist reasons for this. And if they don't stack up as reasons all the time, they are at least, in a sense, explanatory of a condition. The mass medium writer has two major problem areas in which he must write. These two areas represent roughly the nature of the medium and the writer's identity. Okay, so I guess we're going to get to the two problem areas. The nature of the medium. Built into television drama are innate and homegrown problems that do not exist in any other art form. Tell me. Television, while unique in its potentials, is further unique in its limitations. In playwriting, this is particularly true. For example, in no other writing form is the author so fettered by the clock. The half-hour program will sustain a story for only 23 odd minutes. The hour program calls for a 48 to 50-minute play. It is unheard of that a legitimate playwright must write within so rigid and inflexible a time frame, but the TV writer must. It is further arbitrary that his play must break twice in a half-hour show and 3 times in an hour show to allow time for the commercial messages. Obviously, there are some plays that will not in any circumstances lend themselves to such an artificial stoppage. The break will hurt the flow, the continuity in the build, but the break must come. And what do you do about it? This time problem extends over into another area, production. The average hour television show rehearses for 8 or 9 days. This means a little over a week allotted to reading, staging, blocking, line learning, camera, dress rehearsals, and finally production. Contrast this with a Broadway play that rehearses on an average of 1 month to a stage production that runs only twice as long as its television counterpart. Very recently, when Playhouse 90 began telecasting on a weekly basis with a 90-minute play each week, it was thought that here at last was the time frame long and flexible enough to aid the writer in handling plot, character, and pacing. I, for one, gratefully accepted the assignments for the first 2 plays of this new series, thinking, as did most others, that with about 70 minutes allotted the play, it would be moving out of an igloo into a mansion. But once again, television's own peculiar limitations cropped up, and instead of aiding the playwright, the new time frame within this program did nothing but hurt him. For instead of a regular 3-act arrangement, Playhouse 90 took a host of sponsors, each demanding at least 2 commercials. The result was that during the 90 minutes the show had to be divided into 12 and 13-minute segments. each separated by a commercial, so that the overall effect was that of a chopped-up collection of short dramatic segments torn apart and intruded upon by constantly recurring commercials. Scenes had to be automatically curtained at a high emotional pitch to accommodate the stoppage of action, the commercial, and then pick up the thread of storyline. It is obvious that a succession of phony curtains or emotional high points will eventually dilute the effect of any play. An audience can get used to and almost oblivious to bomb blasts if they occur often enough. The physical limitations of the television drama are part and parcel of the innate problems of the writer. 4 or 5 basic sets represent the maximum stretching of both facilities and imagination. I might parenthetically state here that television's intimacy, so often its strength, is an outgrowth of this weakness. We had to be intimate. We didn't have the room to be anything else. In New York, the mecca of live television drama, the set problems are the greatest and show the least possibility of improvement. Most of the shows are birthed in old movie houses, buildings that are the victims of the young medium which now utilizes them. They are I'm sorry, guys. They are segmentized, overextended, and asked to serve in a capacity they were not designed for. Okay, I'm going to get back on track. This lack of space is often reflected in the techniques of television playwriting. The author must often probe vertically because there just aren't enough inches to let him spread out horizontally. But while time and space present hurdles, the most important limitation of the television dramatist is not totally physical. In a sense, it is more philosophical. And this happens to be the simple and fundamental fact that our economy is geared to advertising. For good or for bad, the television play must ride piggyback on the commercial product. It serves primarily as the sugar to sweeten the usually unpalatable sales pitch. It's the excuse to wangle and hold an audience. The play is forced to become a kissing cousin to an entity totally foreign to it. The audience, during a 1-hour viewing of a drama, is forcibly deprived of that drama and in its place is exposed to 3 minutes of Madison Avenue dynamics. The audience must then make its own mental and emotional realignment to get back with the sole object of its intentions. That it can do it all is a tribute to mass intelligence and selectivity. Rod. I don't really believe there exists a good form of commercial. There are some that are less distasteful than others, but at best they're intrusive. And even in the most absolutely palatable form, they thrust a cleaver into the overall effect of a television drama. And they do it 3 times during its all too brief playing, even more during the 90-minute shows. I make reference to this by way of pointing out a basic weakness of the medium. I do not presume to suggest any antidotes or alternatives. At the moment, none seems possible. A sponsor invests heavily in television as an organ of dissemination. That organ would wither away without his capital and without his support. In many ways, he hinders its development and its refinement, but by his presence, he guarantees its survival. Still, I don't think it is possible to generalize about the sponsor or the agency or the networks themselves. They vary as to the intensity of their dogmas, the legitimacy of their concerns, and the extent of their interference in a given television play. But at their very worst, their interference is an often stultifying, often destructive, and inexcusable byproduct of our mass media system. It extends into an area of dramatic creation that should by all rights lie well outside their bailiwick and well beyond their scope of prerogative. I think it is a basic truth that no dramatic art form should be dictated and controlled by men whose training, interest, and instincts are cut of entirely different cloth. The fact remains that these gentlemen sell consumer goods, not an art form. A few years ago, on a program called Appointment with Adventure, I was called in to make alterations in some of the dialogue. I was asked not to use the words American or lucky, Instead, the words were to be changed to United States and fortunate. The explanation was that this particular program was sponsored by a cigarette company and that American and Lucky connotated a rival brand of cigarettes. After establishing beyond any doubt that my leg wasn't being pulled and that this wasn't some cheap, overstated gag, I did the only thing a writer can do in television in the way of a protest. I asked that my name be withheld from the script. It was not the alteration of the language in this case was a okay. It was not the It was not that the alteration of the language in this case was of particular consequence, or to any large degree changed the story. But in the matter of principle, I felt that this was ludicrous interference, and I didn't want to be part of it. I'll never forget the man from Talent Associates, the outfit that produced the show, explaining to me that this was not the happiest state of affairs, but that writers as well as any connected with the show should keep in mind that it's altogether proper for a sponsor to utilize certain prerogatives since he's paying for what goes on. Extending this kind of logic, we might assume that it's altogether proper for a beer company executive to have a hand in managing a baseball club whose games are televised under his sponsorship. Exactly where is the line of demarcation between the play and the commercial? No one seems to know. Ideally, the sponsor should have no more right of interference than an advertiser in a magazine. Theoretically, at least, this advertiser has no say over the policy of the magazine he buys space in, nor should he have even to a minute degree. But in a television today, the writer is hamstrung and closeted in a myriad. Jesus Christ. But in television today, the writer is hamstrung and closeted in by a myriad of taboos, regulations, and imposed dogma that dictate to him what he can write about and what he can't. In the television seasons of 1952 and 1953, almost every television play I sold to the major networks was non-controversial. This is to say that in terms of their themes, they were socially inoffensive and dealt with no current human problem in which battle lines might be drawn. After the production of Patterns, when my things were considerably easier to sell, in a mad and impetuous moment I had the temerity to tackle a theme that was definitely two-sided in its implications. I think this story is worth repeating. Let me have a drink. The script was called Noon on Doomsday. It was produced by the Theater Guild on the United States Steel Hour in April 1956. The play, in its original form, followed very closely the Till case in Mississippi, where a young Negro boy was kidnapped and killed by two white men who went to trial and were exonerated on both counts. The righteous and continuing wrath of the Northern press opened no eyes and touched no consciences in the little town in Mississippi where the two men were tried. It was like a cold wind that made them huddle together for protection against an outside force which they could equate with an adversary. It struck me at the time that the entire trial and its aftermath was simply, they're bastards, but there are bastards. So I wrote a play in which my antagonist was not just a killer, but a regional idea. It was a story of a little town banding together to protect its own against outside condemnation. At no point in the conception of my story was there a black-white issue. The victim was an old Jew who ran a pawn shop. The killer was a neurotic malcontent who lashed out at something or someone who might be materially or physically the scapegoat for his own unhappy, purposeless, miserable existence. Philosophically, I felt that I was on sound ground. I felt that I was dealing with a sociological phenomenon, the need of human beings to have a scapegoat to rationalize their own shortcomings. That's an L. I'll say it again. The need of human beings to have a scapegoat to rationalize their own shortcomings. It stands out, guys. Noon on Doomsday finally went on the air several months later, but in a welter of publicity that came from some 15,000 letters and wires from white citizens' councils and the like, protesting the production of the play. In news stories, the play had been erroneously described as a story of the Till case. At one point earlier, during an interview on the coast, I told a reporter from one of the news services the story of Noon on Doomsday. He said, "Sounds like the Till case." I shrugged it off, answering, "If the shoe fits." This is all it took. From that moment on, Noon on Doomsday was the dramatization of the Till case. And no matter how the Theater Guild or the agency representing U.S. Steel denied it, the impression persisted. The offices of the Theater Guild on West 53rd Street in New York City took on all the aspects of a football field 10 seconds after the final whistle blew. Crowds converged, and if there had been a goalpost to tear down, they would have done so. The White Citizens' Councils threatened boycott, and the agency people somberly told me that this was no idle threat. They had accomplished effective boycotts down south against the Ford Motor Company and the makers of Philip Morris cigarettes. In the former case, it seemed that Negro workers had been permitted to work on assembly lines alongside whites. And in the case of Philip Morris, there had been a beauty contest in Chicago where one of the winners was a Negro girl. Remember, this is written in the 50s, I think. This was all it took for a wrathful wind to come up from the south. I asked the agency men at the time how the problem of boycott applied to the United States Steel Company. Did this mean that from then on, that all construction from Tennessee on down would be done with aluminum? Their answer was that the concern of the sponsor was not so much an economic boycott as the resultant strain in public relations. Boo fucking who. These, therefore, were the fears, and this was the antidote. The script was gone over with a fine-tooth comb by 30 different people, and I attended at least 2 meetings a day for over a week, taking down notes as to what had to be changed. My victim could no longer be anyone as specific as an old Jew. He had to be called an unnamed foreigner, and even this was a concession to me, since the agency felt there should not be a suggestion of a minority at all. This was too close to the Till case. Further, it was suggested that the killer in the case was not a psychopathic malcontent, just a good, decent American boy momentarily gone wrong. It was a pure sex brawl to stop this alteration of character. The script was then dissected and combed so that every word of dialogue that might remotely be Southern in context be deleted or altered. At no point in the script could the word lynch be used. No social event, institution, way of life, or simple diet could be indicated that might be Southern in origin. Later, on the set, bottles of Coca-Cola were taken away because this, according to the agency, had Southern connotations. Previously, I had always assumed that Coke was pretty much a national drink and could never, in the farthest stretch of the imagination, be equated with hominy grits and black-eyed peas. But I was shown the error of my thinking. And to carry the above step even further, a geographical change was made in the script so that instead of being a little town of an undesignated location, it was shoved as far north as possible, making it a New England town. It is conceivable that the agency would have placed the action at the North Pole if it hadn't been for the necessary inclusion of Eskimos, which would prove still another minority problem. How can you write? How are you supposed to write anything in these times? For it to open in New England with the customary spires of a white church in the background of the set, so typically Yankee and Puritan, was somewhat ludicrous to behold. But this was to be a total surrender, and there would be no concessions made even to logic. Noon on Doomsday was, in the final analysis, an overwritten play. It was often tract-like, much too direct, and had a habit of overstatement. What destroyed it as a piece of writing was the fact that when it was ultimately produced, its thesis had been diluted, and my characters had mounted a soapbox to shout something that had become too vague to warrant any shouting. The incident of violence that the play talked about should have been representative and symbolic of a social evil. It should have been treated as if a specific incident was symptomatic of a more general problem. But by the time Noon on Doomsday went in front of a camera, the only problem recognizable was that of a TV writer having to succumb to the ritual of track covering so characteristic of the medium he wrote for. It was the impossible task of allegorically striking out at a social evil with a feather duster because the available symbols for allegory were too few, too far between, and too totally dissimilar to what was actually needed. In a way, it was like trying to tell a Jewish joke with a cast of characters consisting of two leprechauns. This track covering takes many forms in television. It is rarely, if ever, successful and carries with it an innate transparency that shows it up for what it is. When Reginald Rose, in an exceptionally fine play, Thunder on Sycamore Street, took an uncompromising swipe at a brand of lunacy in our country that recognizes equality as applying only to those whose roots are in the third deck planking of the Mayflower, he had to couch his theme in a language acceptable on Madison Avenue. It was a story of a family in a residential street being bullied and pushed around by their neighbors because the guy happened to be an ex-convict. The story was originally written about a Negro family. The central conflict in every line of dialogue pointed to the Negro-white problem and the altogether basic premise that sooner or later human beings are going to have to live together side by side. Mr. Rose's enforced track covering was simply exchanging an ex-convict for a Negro. And this is a process a TV writer has to learn and to perfect. He must hunt and peck until he finds a more acceptable minority than a Negro, often the American Indian. This is, of course, somewhat limiting, since it is, of course, somewhat limiting, since it is a difficult minority problem to play in New England. But television sponsors and agencies are prone to accept slight inconsistencies when it comes to skirting a sticky issue. I am afraid that eventually we TV writers may run out of substitutes. I suppose then, because we are pretty inventive and imaginative guys, the standard minority scapegoat will turn out to be a robot, and this will step on no toes whatsoever. But in the meantime, a medium best suited to illuminate and dramatize the issues of the times has its product pressed into a mold, painted lily white, and has its dramatic teeth yanked one by one. Sometimes television is faced with a problem where it is physically impossible to substitute an idea. Last year, I was faced with such a problem when I wrote a script called The Arena, which was done on Studio One. In this case, I was dealing with a political story where much of the physical action took place on the floor of the United States Senate. One of the edicts that comes down from the Mount Sinai of Advertisers Row is that at no time in a political drama must a speech or character be equated with an existing political party or current political problems. Like, how are you supposed to do this job? Some of these problems, however, are now so hoary, Hoary, with age, and so meaningless in modern context that they are stamped as acceptable. Slavery, for example, can now be talked about without blushing. Suffrage is another issue that need make no one wince. The treatment of the lunatic in chains and dungeons can no longer be considered controversial. But The Arena took place in 1956 and no juggling of documentary of the year. It was a program on CBS called Out of Darkness, and it had been repeated 3 times. It was a moving, powerful, and telling story of the effects and treatment of mental illness, and it also was the work of one individual, Al Wasserman, who conceived it, wrote it, and produced it. When the award was announced, the recipient was not Mr. Wasserman, but one Sig Mickelson. Later on, in almost a bone-throwing gesture, Mr. Wasserman did receive a certificate of merit, but the major award went to one of the vice presidents of the network, not to the man who was singularly responsible for the program itself. I have no doubt that Mr. Mickelson gave great moral and perhaps physical aid to the creation and ultimate production of Out of Darkness, but, as always, it is a fact that first came the word, and that any kudos to be offered should have gone to the writer from whose mind and at whose typewriter the idea was given life and nurtured, not to a network executive whose major claim to recognition in this case was simply that he was permissive to the idea of the program. I agree. I cite these Emmy and Sylvania Award dinners is somehow characteristic of the almost begrudging attitude the industry saves for its writers. For the rank and file among them never, or at least rarely, appear as an important adjunct to a press release. When a show is publicized, it is always the star, sometimes the story, and almost never the writer. And when the awards are made, despite the fact that every program owes its basic existence to the efforts of a writer, he himself stands nearest the end of the line to get his. I cannot complain because of the lack of identity. I am one of the handful of fortunates who have been able to grub and battle our way into relative limelight. I get my publicity, perhaps too much publicity, with little effort. Chayefsky is the same way, and so are Reginald Rose, Gore Vidal, Bob Arthur, and a few others. But to the average men or women who supply the raw materials of entertainment via the typewriter, recognition is sadly lacking. And if there are any fingers to be pointed, they must point to the networks and the agencies who cry for material, but at the same time find the name value of its creators immaterial. You guys are hanging in. Let's see. The Anatomy of Success. Okay. The Anatomy of Success. On January 13th, 1955, the Kraft Television Theater presented Patterns. 1 minute after the show went off the air, my phone started to ring. It has been ringing ever since. There are two ways for a writer to achieve success. One is the long haul, the establishing of a record of consistent quality in his work. The other way is the so-called overnight success, charged and generated by a single piece of writing that captures the imagination and the fancy of the public and the critics. Patterns was that kind of piece. It came on the air unheralded, but pushed me into the limelight with a fabled kind of entry. In 2 weeks after its initial production, it was telecast again 1 month later. The following happened to me. I received 23 firm offers for television writing assignments. I received 3 motion picture offers for screenplay assignments. I had 14 requests for interviews from leading magazines and newspapers. I had 2 offers of lunch from Broadway producers. I had 2 offers to discuss novels with publishers. You guys, this is amazing. In addition to the above, I sold 6 television pieces in a row. Plays that had been knocking around for anywhere from 6 months to 3 years. And they all went quickly with no price haggling. No bidding wars? All of a sudden, with no preparation and no expectations, I had a velvet mantle draped over my shoulders. I treaded my way through a brand new world of dollar-sign mobiles hanging from the sky, shaking hands with my right hand, depositing checks with my left, watching my bank account grow, reading my name in the papers and magazines, listening to myself being complimented unreservedly and extravagantly. It had all the glittering, dreamlike quality of the sudden and spectacular rise to the top, and it was great to live with it for a while, very great. There were moments of disquiet in the beginning, the sudden cooling off of friends who were afraid to phone because they were afraid of misconstrued motives. They wanted to remain friends, not to be glad-handing hangers-on. Into the breach that they left came the other phone calls from the long line of phonies. The people who a month before didn't care if I lived or fell off a bridge. I've heard of this before. And now they were the loudest in their praise. They were the perspicacious ones who had recognized my talent many years before. Some of them weren't phonies, really. This is the cast business. Sometimes you have to wait for people to get into your league before you invite them to play ball. And this was the case with me. Some producers' waiting rooms that had provided many hours of heel cooling for me in years past suddenly became my old alma mater. And I was the prodigal son when I walked through the door. These are some of the little accoutrements to success that you never can prepare for but learn to get accustomed to damn quick once you've achieved it. And then, almost plan, there are new aspects to your living and your writing that follow the success. For one thing, I had a spotlight on me and a spotlight on my work. It was constant, bright, and revealing. Like a good horse or a swivel hip halfback, I was the guy to watch. I had the ball, I was up top, and I was fair game. I was studied, assessed, and dissected. In the month that followed, everything I had on television was plugged, bugled, and advertised. It was also carefully watched and reviewed. The big thing, the important thing, was that whatever I had on was invariably compared to the one successful thing I had already done. And also, almost as invariably, the new piece didn't take to the comparison. Overnight successes are almost always something special. They hit some kind of basic nerve of reaction. They achieve some fantastic universality. They accomplish by accident so much more than can usually be accomplished by design. I agree. In my case, the first reviews of the shows after Patterns were charitable. Benefits of doubt were freely exchanged. It was as if critics were wary of throwing a brickbat at a successful author for fear that their own analysis might be incorrect. After all, this is the guy who wrote Patterns. But after a time, when the comparisons become even more obviously negative, the needle was unsheathed. It got longer, it probed deeper, and I began to bleed. For on the periphery of every success, in the shadows just outside the limelight, is a hulking, brooding monster known as a flash in the pan. Patterns wasn't my only success, but it evolved as the single standard by which I was judged. It was a point of comparison. It was the stock reference for quality. And where once its title conjured up the sweet smell of success, the odor now became just a little acrid and unpleasant, and I began to get sick of it. I'd written other things. I assured people. I made it a point in interviews to slough off the title, and I became preoccupied with the old plays that preceded it and the new ones to follow. And it wasn't too long before I realized that sometimes the writing that brought you success on a platter was also the writing that evolved as your principal competition. I now had to fight myself, or at least something I'd done. I had something to prove, first to others and then to myself. I had to prove that Patterns wasn't all I had. There had been other things before, and there would be other things to follow. As it turned out, it took a long time to prove. Almost 2 years. I thought that The Rack was better written than Patterns. I thought that Noon on Doomsday had more innate power. I thought The Strike, done on Studio One in June 1954, had more universality and more appeal. But I was a minority of one. On a network radio interview a few months ago, I was introduced as Rod Serling, the man who wrote Patterns, and a long pause. And, well, here he is, Rod Serling. One of the plays in this volume turned out to be the one that, for the moment anyway, pushed back the specter of the flash in the pan. This was Requiem for a Heavyweight. It appeared in October 1956 on Playhouse 90 on CBS. In many ways, it seemed to catch the public imagination just as Patterns had. Its reviews were fabulously good, and now in the columns I'm Rod Serling, who wrote Patterns and Requiem for a Heavyweight. To any writer, or to any human being for that matter, who has not slept with success, breathed its rich oxygen, and gamboled through the crazy pink whipped cream world that it opens up, all this may sound carping and unimportant. I'll concede the point that a good bank account, a paid-for car, and a guarantee of your kids' education go a long way to compensate for some momentary hurt feelings and some bad reviews. But I guess it's part of the strangely complex human mechanism to want to savor success. Television makes this impossible. It changes its diet not only weekly and daily, but hourly. A writer's claim to recognition doesn't take the passage of time very well. This claim gets lost in the shuffle and is forgotten. Marty becomes obscure when 12 Angry Men takes its place, and then Patterns takes over. It moves to the rear when A Man is 10 Feet Tall comes to the fore. That in turn gets replaced by A Night to Remember, which is not long remembered when suddenly appears Requiem for a Heavyweight. The challenge, the competition, the frenetic staccato pace of television is forever pushing people off the pedestal, shoving someone else up there and continuing the process. To the viewing audience, this is a guarantee, almost, of continuing quality or at least an attempt toward it. To the writer, it dictates the purchase of a scrapbook, which is probably the only way he'll find a permanence and recognition, in the written record of what he has already done. Because for better or worse, television takes all its achievements and makes them history within a few hours of their presentation. Whatever the psychological disturbances that stem from the overindulgences of the overnight success, there are obviously a lot of kicks to becoming known, financially independent and in demand. Here is a smattering of day-to-day accoutrements for having been to being a reasonably well-known writer. 1. I receive, on the average, of 5 to 10 letters a week with offers of collaboration. A guy who writes as much as you must certainly need some fresh ideas from the outside. I invariably try to answer every letter, probably from a sense of compulsion and a good memory. I wrote a lot of correspondence myself with collaborative ideas before I was eating gravy. 2. I drive a 1957 white Lincoln convertible, so long, so garish, so obvious that my wife blushes when she looks at it in the driveway. It's the first big luxury car I've ever owned, and it's one of the few overt gestures of ostentatiousness on my part. 3. I fell almost immediately into the speech pattern of the theater with its propensity for terms of endearment. Sweetie, baby, darling, dear. I hate to hear other people use these terms, but I'm aware of using them constantly. Why? 4. I'm considered to be a cooperative writer. Even now, I don't get my backup at requests for rewrites. I rarely, if ever, give producers or directors trouble. But now, as I never did in the early days, I'll at least speak my mind about what I consider to be a wrong approach or an incorrect interpretation. In the pre-patterns days, I would unquestioningly do any rewrite, change or delete any conception without a single question asked. 5. I have never ceased liking publicity. This isn't ego for its own sake, because I don't drop names and I don't purposely seek it. But I still get a kick when I see my name in the paper, and I probably always will. 6. Bad reviews jar me down to the instep. I will never become philosophically resigned to a negative reaction to something I've written. The difference now is that I'm more prone to want to share the blame for a bad show. I try to analyze where the writing was at fault, as opposed to where the production let it down. In the old days, I invariably made the assumption that it was always uniquely my fault. 7. I have a hell of a schedule, and I'm never without a writing project of some sort. If it isn't a screenplay, it's a television play. 8. I discovered along the way that movies and television are separate entities, and each makes different demands on writing. You write big for the movies. You let your camera tell considerably more story than you do in television. You write with a much more pronounced sense of physical action than you're permitted in the electronic medium. Television also demands a visual sense, but very often the progression of a story must be indicated by dialogue. In the movies, it can often be externalized just by what is seen and not necessarily by what is heard. 9. I like Hollywood and motion pictures, though I felt intimidated when I went out there to do my first picture. I was at Metro at the time and was given an office 40 feet long and a secretary, both new to me. Sitting at my desk the first day, I was approached by a secretary from down the hall who had seen my coffee pot on the desk. I drank coffee from morning till night. and who asked me if she might borrow some sugar for the Kafkalash being held by some writers down the hall. I gave her the sugar with a little penciled note saying, "This sugar comes to you courtesy New York television." The next day the sugar came back, each cube marked with a skull and crossbones with the legend, "TV writer, go home." This went a long way toward breaking the ice. The next morning I was invited to the Clash, and I began to make some good and lasting friends from that moment on. I'm beginning to feel that the Hollywood I felt so intimidated about is a Hollywood that in many ways doesn't exist anymore, if it ever did. There once may have existed the Odette's version of a phony, falsely glittering world full of sick people satiated with money, sex, and applause, a flimsy, unreal world that would disappear if someone were to yell, "Cut!" But the Hollywood of today, at least the one I found, had no more than its share of phonies or neuroses. It was no better and no worse than the New York television world, or for that matter, any area in the theater. I met a lot of adults in Hollywood, producers, directors, writers, and some agents whom I was proud to know. They were sober, intelligent, as normal as I human beings. As in any social sphere or profession, you pick your own friends and your own social milieu. You don't walk on the wild side unless you choose to. 10. In looking back over the relatively short span of my career, I sometimes make mental notes of the people I'm indebted to. They are legion, but a few of them bear special mention. There was my first agent, Blanche Gaines, who took me on when no one else would have me, who browbeat me, mothered me, argued with me, and did some considerable swinging for me, and to whom I owe a great deal. There was Dick McDonough, already mentioned, who gave what is so much at a premium in this business, time and trouble. There were directors like Ralph Nelson, Johnny Frankenheimer, Dick Good, and Dan Petrie, who respected me long before a writer got much respect from most quarters. There were producers like Felix Jackson, Martin Manulis, Mort Abrahams, who judge a man several feet away from the bandwagon. And there were the editors like Florence Britton of Studio One and Ed Rice of Kraft, who professionally and personally gave me many a boost up the ladder. In the final analysis, it is relatively simple to buy from a well-known writer. I think it takes a hell of a lot more insight and a much more knowledgeable feeling for the profession to buy scripts from unknown authors, which all of these people did and continue to do. 11. I don't know where I'm going, and I'm not sure where I am. My erstwhile success stems from a comparatively small number of plays, far too few, really, to lay any legitimate claim to permanence in the literary scene. I think it's really a moot question as to how I've got this far with the present track record that I lay claim to. I think that I am a good writer, but an undeveloped one, and I rather think that this applies to most young television writers. They have benefited enormously from the public attention that has come to them in far greater degree than that received by most writers in pre-television days. All of us have an obligation to our craft and to the audience to justify this attention. We must aim higher, write better, dig deeper. There are some basic values that apply to all writing, be it television, movies, the novel, or anything else. A writer has to write as best he knows how. And ultimately, if this effort shows talent, he will be recognized. Whew. Afterthoughts. We're almost there, kids. Television is a potpourri of good things and bad, a medium of promise and intelligence, and, at the same time, an electronic oat burner in the always land of cliché. On the negative side, here are some practices in television I feel strongly about to mention. For example, I find it shoddy and inexcusable for dramatic shows to pick up their actors and actresses after the curtain in the so-called star dressing room and have them plug products. Whether or not their performances during the program were good, this is an absolute guarantee that they won't be remembered. All that remains is the memory of a gratuitous, phony pitch thrust in at the end. I am embarrassed when movie actresses hired as show hostesses flounce into tacky living rooms on certain dramatic film anthologies against a background of oversweet violins. The embarrassment becomes even more acute when they launch into a patently ridiculous reason for the plot of the show that night. For example, we got a beautiful letter from a farm woman in Idaho telling us of the romance of corn husking. It's called She Found Romance While Corn Husking, and will bring you Act 1 after this important word to you ladies about protecting your hands. I get a violent reaction to certain dramatic show MCs who preface each act with a resume of what happened in the previous act. I assume this is based on a belief that a 1-minute commercial destroys memory and a recapitulation is necessary. But this carryover of the old soap opera technique has no place in the theater, and there is no excuse for it on television. I hate most beer commercials, with the notable and refreshing exception of the Peel brothers and the incomparable Bert and Harry. The majority of the cousin brews are littered with catchwords, slogans, and raucous singing jingles that dent the ears. Cigarette ads seem to be no less offensive on television. And the worst commercial of any, bar none, is the dramatized Dr. Pitchman in a white medical coat who juggles test tubes and ponderously exhorts you to do what his patients do. Perhaps this is the natural evolution of the old traveling snake oil shows. But then at least the hucksters did sleight of hand and a few buck and wings before launching into the pitch. Probably because I am a writer, I am acutely aware of the next television fault, which makes me wince whenever it is in evidence. This is simply what I think of as oblique slant of language or theme that is meant to be earthy, gutsy, or tough. Since profanity is frowned on, the medium has devised its own compensatory language. Devil replaces hell. Blast you is alternative to damn. And for anything with more passion, the actor just bites his lips in soundless fury. I remember an emotional second-act curtain in a television play called The Strike, which I wrote for Studio One in June 1954. An Army officer is called upon to ask for an airstrike on an area where he knows 20 of his own men are. The scene calls for him to throw a bottle against a map board and say that he's just about to give the order to blow his own men to hell. It took exactly 9 days to impress upon the legal department of CBS that in this given situation, an officer wouldn't say darn, shucks, or gosh. To retain the one word took all the efforts of the program's editor, Florence Britton, the producer, Felix Jackson, and the director, Frank Schaffner. But finally, we won our little semantic victory. And I remember Floss Britton coming back into the studio the day of the show, bussing me lightly on my flushed and excited cheek, saying, "We're in business, Roddy. We've traded them 2 dams for the hell." This is a more dislike, but very often the writer is called upon to pad a part to make it more palatable to a sought-after actor or actress. But this goes on all the time when a script is submitted by the writer and in turn sent over to the agency for the actors to read. These people owe their careers to exposure and the right kind of exposure, but many a good script has died a-borning because it has been constitutionally unable to withstand the onslaught of padding a role, or twisting a storyline to change a characterization. In the miserably tight time framework of a television play, there is room for only so many lines and so much story. For every added line, one must be deleted, and it is this cycle of add and withdraw that does irreparable damage to a story. But there are a lot of things in the medium I write for that I like and admire. They are more than things, really. They are people as well. I like most of the editors I've worked with. The editor is in the totally untenable position of acting as a catalyst in a weekly situation that involves the writer on one end and the advertising agency on the other. He is the constant hassle of passing on the agency's fears to the writer with enough diplomatic finesse to keep the writer from cutting his throat. At the same time, the editor has to keep the script as intact as possible without the agencies yanking it off because of their fears. This latter action is not an everyday occurrence, but it does happen. One script of mine, called The Bomb Fell on Thursday, was cast and had one rehearsal, and the sets were ordered, when the agency yanked it because of a question of taste. Writers and editors together have to face up to one basic truth: the agency is all powerful. It is extremely difficult to cross the young and Rubicon. I also like the television directors. They are mostly a young lot, and if the reader has ever watched a television drama produced in a studio, he realizes the consummate talent required of them. They must know acting and actors, sets and designs, lighting and sounds, blocking and business, story and writer. And at that point, where the legitimate play director quietly steals off into the darkness in the rear of the theater to entrust his work to the opening night cast, this is when the TV director works the hardest in the most trying, frenetic, inhuman tension imaginable. At this point, he is an obstetrician assisting at a birth, but he's also nurse, anesthetist, I can never say it, anesthetist, you get it, and general manager of the hospital. When it's close to airtime and I happen to be on set, I invariably break into a cold sweat, wondering how in God's name the show will ever get on the road. Nerves like the common cold are easily transmitted. I can remember one time on the Danger Show when I was bodily removed from the set by John Frankenheimer, 6'5", because I was turning his actors' sense of well-being into a shambles by gratuitously reminding them of their cues and stage directions. A couple of years later, on another show directed by John, he saw to it that I received a little gift just prior to airtime. It was a beribboned box that, on being opened, revealed a neatly wrapped package of adhesive tape. I can't say that I like television critics because I really don't know many personally. But I respect them, and I'm glad they're around. Their presence is a tacit assertion that the television program is an art form that warrants and merits critical analysis. The function of the television critic is somewhat different from that of his counterparts who reviews movies and plays. The latter are, in a basic sense, previewers. Their writing is read to determine whether a movie or play is worth the price of admission and the inconvenience of getting there. The television critic analyzes a play or program that is already a fact. He can bring no one in and discourage no one to keep away. He is a critic and not a preview. It's a needle or a backslap that can in no way affect whatever is in the record. My own feeling is that the television critic has one primary purpose. He's there to needle and prod the industry into quality. He's there as a reminder that nothing can be slipped by. His very presence sets up certain absolute standards to be aimed at. His approval is solicited, his disapproval keenly felt and pondered. When Jack Gould or J.P. Shanley in the New York Times dislikes something, this precludes the possibility of smash, and conversely, their benign approval is cause for celebration on the part of the writer and all concerned. In the case of my own patterns, the demand for a repeat was generated by the critics and the columnists. Jack Gould's calling it one of those inspired moments that make the theater the wonder that it is, did more to make it a TV legend than the thousands of letters sent in by viewers. Critics, in short, pack weight. As to the legitimacy of the various analysis, this is not nearly so absolute as the standards the critic sets up for the industry he writes about. 10 different TV critics will come up with 10 different reactions to a given television play. Check the following box score, for example, as it applies to the critical reaction toward one of my shows on Studio One. Okay. Here we go. 6 little reviews. Harry Harris, Philadelphia Inquirer. In the arena on Studio One last night, Serling did much to regain his pattern's prestige. Hang on, I gotta blow my nose. I'll read it again. Sorry. I'll read it again. Harry Harris, Philadelphia Inquirer. In the arena on Studio One last night, Serling did much to regain his pattern's prestige. Ernest Shire, Philadelphia News. I doubt if anything quite as childish transpires as that depicted in Rod Serling's contribution to Studio One last night. Burton Rasco, syndicated columnist, an instructive semi-documentary on the initiation of a new senator in Washington with salutary and agreeable sermon implied rather than stated. Jake Rosenstein, The Hollywood Reporter. Rod Serling must have had to blast his way through the cobwebs with a blowtorch to get the old trunk from which he resurrected the arena. An hour is a real long time for an issue such as this, with characters so conventional and with long, maudlin speeches of mawkish idealism and pat dialogue. That's a bad review. Dave Kaufman, Daily Variety. Chalk up another powerful teleplay for Rod Serling. This time he incisively explores the practice and moral climate of politics. George Condon, The Cleveland Plain Dealer. Rod Selling's... Is that a typo? It'd be funny if that was a typo in the publication. Studio One story, The Arena, turned out to be one of the finest dramatic productions of the year. It was thrilling to encounter a show that went past the superficial plot into the real dramatic conflict that rages inside men who are torn between good and evil. It's almost as if everybody has their own opinion. Who'da thunk? So that concludes the foreword and the essays by Rod Serling, and is a precursor to the actual publication of the play Patterns, for which it's, let's see, looking. Let's see. I'm almost done, guys. I'll wrap it up here shortly. I'm going on like 2.5 hours here. Let's see. 107 pages. It's a really good play. I highly recommend it. I want to show these pictures real quick. And then I'm going to stop because I got to pee. And you guys have held on way too long, and I really appreciate it. Thank you. Shit. Let's see. Let me see. Oh, author's commentary on patterns. Okay, I don't have the bladder space to read this. Do I? Fuck. All right, I'm going to have to. Author's commentary on patterns. Patterns was written in the fall of 1954, shortly after I had taken my wife and family from Ohio to the East. It took me into television's elite quickly and fabulously. But actually, as noted by Time magazine in its review of the program, it was a soundly built play that derived even greater impetus by the most uniquely consistent acting and production ever accorded a television play. Fielder Cook's direction was creatively and artistically a total triumph. The acting of Richard Kiley, Everett Sloane, Ed Begley, Elizabeth Wilson, and everyone else was almost unbelievably excellent. As to the play, it was good, perhaps better than good. Quite mistakenly, people have attributed its quality to the author's keen perception about big business and its ramifications. Actually, Patterns was not at all conceived as a big business opus. I had never occupied a position in the upper executive echelons, nor had I even ever functioned in what could be legitimately called big business. Patterns is a story of power. It is also parenthetically a conflict of youth versus age. It is set against a background of big business, and it utilizes some of the inherent problems that arise in that kind of a situation. But it is not truly a big business story. There is no single character within it who could be considered a prototype of an economic system, or at least any distinct level of that system. The same kind of conflict could arise if this had been a war story, a political story, or the story of a foreman on an assembly line. I couched it in terms of big business because there is an innate kind of romance in the big, the blustering, and the successful. But there is, in the final analysis, nothing Marxist in the message of this play. It is not an indictment of our capitalistic system, nor an expose of the evils of big money. It is a story of ambition and the price tag that hangs on success. If it professes actually to have a message, it is simply that every human being has a minimum set of ethics from which he operates. This minimum set of ethics often injects itself into a man's own journey upward against competition. When he refuses to compromise these ethics, his career must suffer, and when he does compromise them, his conscience does the suffering. There are tragic overtones to this because our society is a competitive one. For every man who goes up, someone has to leave. And when the departure of the aged is neither philosophical nor graceful, there is a kind of aching poignance in this kind of changing of the guard. The success of Patterns was uniquely due to a kind of team effort. I have already mentioned the fabulous direction and acting, but the support came also on an editorial level. A totally new conception of the ending came from the editor Arthur Singer, and it proved to be perhaps one of the most successful and lauded moments of the play. Most television productions are collaborative, but Patterns evolved, I think, a little more collaboratively than most. In analyzing the writing of Patterns, you will note that though the dialogue is literate, sometimes almost archaic, there is still an overall pattern of simplicity about it. There is a spare, concise measurement in the writing that gives its flow and legitimacy. You will note that in the final scene between Ramsay and Sloane, the two forces clash head-on, one with a violence and anger generated by disgust, and the other with a zealous fanaticism that is neither blind nor illogical. When these two giants tangle, it is still a scene of comparative brevity. In fact, with the exception of the conference room scenes, no individual section of the play seems prolonged or padded. Each has its place, its function, and its own particular meaning within the scheme of the story. It follows the classic lines of the tragedy in a way that could be plotted on a graph. There is the step-by-step culmination of all the ingredients, the arrival of Staples, the establishment of his talent and strengths, the subtle overtones of Andy Sloane's worn-out usefulness, the duplication of the two men's positions, the stalking specter of progress that pushes Staples and seeks to pull down Sloane, the agonizing inevitability of Sloane's demise, along with the jarring, wrenching ambivalence of Fred Staples' hunger for success, that is nonetheless not so bright to blind his own awareness of another man's agony. All this is the pattern of a handful of lives with the prime mover, Walter Ramsay, at the helm, pushing, prodding, squeezing in the name of progress and profit. Underlying all this is a subplot. There is the ambition of Fred Staples' wife. There is the poignant sort of half-groping understanding of Andy Sloane's young son. And there is the despairing dignity of Marge, now Staples' secretary, who has come over to him from Andy Sloane. Perhaps the only one who clearly sees that whatever Staples' intentions, and no matter the depth of his sensitivities, he's there as a spoiler, and Andy Sloane is his victim. As you read, you'll note that there is little fuzz in the dialogue and in the characterizations. There is a well-defined story with well-delineated people. But the power that is derived from its very simplicity also helps to hide the fact that while there is a vast complexity and depth in its theme, this probing does not extend to its people. With the exception of Walter Ramsay, you'll note a thinness to some of the others. For example, the part of Fran, Staples' wife, is badly drawn. At no single point in her development do we get a reasonably accurate picture of this woman and her motivations. We know that she is ambitious and that her ambition is what prods her husband. We never discover, however, whether or not she shares her husband's sensitivities. We don't know whether she blithely or deliberately chooses to recognize what her husband must do to another fellow human being, or if she realizes this will be one of the byproducts of his success and she chooses to discount it in the name of her ambition. She is a charming, rather glib, but she is She is a charming, rather glib, but in the final analysis, hard to understand young woman. The writing makes her hard to understand. I disagree. I think I do and I don't. She's trying to survive, and her survival is through her husband, who is at a moral quandary, but can't afford to be in a moral quandary to succeed. but moreover survive. He needs a push, and the push is her, so she pushes. And in the pushing, she becomes ruthless, or that's my understanding. See it for yourselves and see what you come up with. Staples, on the other hand, is much more a known quantity. He is written in such a way that we readily perceive the diverse poles on his conscience. We know that he shares his wife's ambition and that with it is a sensitivity. We know that he genuinely likes the man he's been called upon to replace. But in the end of the play, we are never given a really definitive explanation of what he feels the moment he walks away from his moment of truth. Or even if it is a moment of truth. He walks into Walter Ramsey's office after Sloane's heart attack to read a riot act in the name of simple, basic, decent justice. And when he walks out, he has decided to stay and fight, supposedly on his own terms. There is clarity here in his actions, but not in his motives. Whether it stems from belief or rationalization, I have not made clear. Actually, in my own mind, I must excuse this lack of clear-cut direction, because I feel that Fred Staples is himself unsure as to his reasons for staying. Ambiguity is human nature, Serling. When he walks out of Walter Ramsey's office, his battered conscience has not been assuaged, but the tense and taut emotions of the past hours, along with his fatigue, have taken away some of his own awareness. He is not certain at this given moment whether he has won or Ramsey has conned him into thinking he's won. In the motion picture version of Patterns, this vague disquiet on the part of Fred Staples is more clearly shown. When he greets his wife waiting for him in the lobby, he says something about it being easy enough to chuck something, suggesting that he is already rationalizing away a gnawing and persistent little doubt that his victory was nothing more than a sellout. It is interesting, particularly in the case of Patterns, to review its transition into terms of motion picture from its original television form. There was no basic ingredient left out for want of time in its original television form. Consequently, when I translated it into terms of motion pictures, there was little in the way of expansion needed, except a more or less horizontal expansion. Many scenes could now be prefaced by a physical introduction, i.e., Wall Street before we enter the offices. Right now, my feelings, subject to change, are that this additional horizontal scope added nothing to the overall quality and effect of Patterns. I agree. I liked the television version better than the film version. If anything, something of its incisiveness, sharpness, and clarity, and some of its taut kind of understatement seem to have been somewhat diffused, I agree. Only in the boardroom scenes did the story seem to gain in the movie. In television, because of its time limitations, there exists the necessity for showing a part to suggest the whole. In the case of a board meeting, which in the context of the story is of vital importance, we do not have time to show the entire board meeting. We can show only a few dibs and dabs of the proceedings and then get right into the action that is important. Thus, although an audience knows that any board meeting must last at least an hour or so, in television it lasts but a few moments, and if successful gives the illusion of lasting longer. This illusion was sustained somewhat in the television performance. There was a suggestion of things on the agenda that were properly vague and complex. But it wasn't long before the conflict at hand was introduced with the colloquy between Ramsey and Sloane. But though few people were aware of the approximately 6-minute board meetings, there was an overall effect of staccato and hurry up that did not enhance the realism of the performance. In the movie, this effect has been aided. Though the scenes are not in themselves much longer, the illusion of length and an agenda seems better drawn. It comes more from camera than from writing. The corridor, the room, and the visual play on the characters add a dimension that was lacking on television. As of this, writing Patterns has proven to no boon to the motion picture exhibitors. Rather, it has played to only sporadically good houses with a record of financial return that has been sparse and disappointing. Its reviews as a motion picture matched their television counterparts. These have been, with only one or two exceptions, consistently fine. If we can utilize this as a measure, we can make a further assumption that Patterns' comparative failure is more economic than artistic. Perhaps an audience, however taken with the television show, is not so prone to spend money to see it again in another form. This suggests further that the relationship between motion pictures and television is so close in terms of technique that there is little to choose between the two. Basic in any play is its story, and this is the one area which will require the least change in taking one vehicle over from one medium to another. From a writing viewpoint, time is the only big difference in creation. The movies permit more by play, perhaps a bit more by subtlety, and as I indicated before, more horizontal freedom. Scenes can play longer and characters can say and do more, but the story unfolds in much the same way. Its physical trappings are extended, colored and costumed, but it is questionable how this will implement a dramatic effect in the story, if the story itself has an innate power that has previously come through without those trappings. But with all its faults and foibles, Patterns must have on a truth, and this truth had its roots in the behavior of men and women. Almost half of the several hundred letters I received after Patterns' initial television performance pointedly asked if this wasn't really the story of so-and-so a company with Mr. A and Mr. B. This was then no indictment of big business. The characters in Patterns have their counterparts in real life on many levels. If, on the other hand, any indictment is suggested, it is simply an indictment of the imposed values of a society that places such stock in successes and has so little preoccupation with morality when success has been attained. And this is not the morality of good and evil, not the black and white of what is fundamentally right and wrong. This is the morality of the fringes, the plowing under of human dignity in the name of progress, and the mass production attitude toward the individual because his goods and services happen to be efficiently produced by mass production methods. This is morality's shady side of the street. The patterns of which this piece speaks are behavior patterns of little human beings in a big world, lost in it, intimidated by it, and whose biggest job is to survive in it. And it will never not be relevant. That was really good. Really, 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 really good. Yeah, I think I'm going to show a few pictures, and then I'm about to wet my pants. I gotta pee. But Rod Serling, again, I knew him from The Twilight Zone, having never seen The Twilight Zone, and still having never saw it. I came upon his work again many, 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 many years later in Patterns. For me, his name will not die out, and I hope to see more of his work. And what I have seen, it is excellent, and I highly recommend it. This was a really random stream, but I'm really happy to promote it. So let's see. Let's see. Patterns. I can't read it all. Let's see. I can read this, I guess. Oh, wait. Shit. Can't see. Is everything out of frame? Let's see. It's hard. How the fuck? Oh, okay. Sorry. Let's see. On location near the Beekman Downtown Hospital in New York, it was a scene that ultimately never got on the screen, the whole thing being played inside the bar at the right. It's hard to see. But while filming Patterns. Let's see. A movie cameraman's view of the night scene between Fred Staples and Andy Sloan. It's really hard to see. Let's see. Sorry, it's so hard to see. These are good pictures, though, of Ed Begley Sr., Ed Begley Jr.'s father. This was the night scene when Staples finds Andy Sloan alone in the office and in a halting, oblique way tries to talk him into resigning so that he himself will not have to administer the coup de grace. Yeah, it's pretty devastating. Ed Begley Sr. is excellent. Okay, and I'm not going to read all this because I'm about to wet my pants, but you guys can read it if you want. I don't know that you can read it, but these are production stills from, I think, the film version, but it's great. Let's let's see. And yeah, I think that's it. So again, thank you for joining me. Let's see. That's the book if you guys want to pick it up. And let me flip this around one more time. Let's see. And yeah, Rod Serling, great writer. Thanks for joining me. And I don't know if I'll read any of his other works or biography in the streams, but for now, I was really happy to share that. I think I'm saying this for like the 5th time. Thanks for listening, and until next time, I'll see ya. I love you. Thanks.